Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto what-ifs. Today we're jumping into part 2 of What If Naruto Has Chance for a Prophecy? So strap in, because things are about to get explosive. If you're new to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your whole ninja squad. And of course, drop your theories in the comments. Your support is what keeps this shinobi grinding. Chapter 8. Leaders. Toriko suddenly jerked up from his bed, facing the window in front of him. The plain moonlight leaked inside the small room, painting everything in silver. The boy slowly leaned forward to sit cross-legs and buried his head into his laps, trying to calm down his quickly beating heart. After a long minute his panting died down as he caught his breath, leaving the room in complete silence except the distant tick of the clock. The drenched shirt was sticking onto his skin like glue. A shiver ran down on his body from the disgusting feeling. A sigh left his mouth as he peeked at the alarm clock next to the bed. 3 a.m. Damn. He leaned back as he closed his eyes again in the hope that maybe his adrenaline-flushed body could still settle down and fall back to sleep again. He threw out the idea. It was impossible for his alarm-ready body to sink back into a dream. Maybe into another nightmare. He shook his head to ease the already slowly vanishing scenes of him struggling in a sewer in ankle-deep water, the rusty door without a handle and that thing behind it, grumbling only meters from him. Another sigh left his mouth and he slowly headed towards the bathroom for a life-saving shower. A small group gathered in Minato's apartment as it was a direct order from him to be there exactly on time, especially underlined for Kakashi who, to everyone's surprise, showed up on time. The whole team and Kushina were sitting impatiently in the living room waiting for the one who ordered absolute punctuality. The redhead seemed to be the most irritated, given how she was sitting on the couch and leaning against her palm while she tapped her cheek with remarkable speed. If he doesn't arrive soon, I'm going to kill him. He will be expelled from the bedroom to sleep on this couch if he doesn't appear in the next 30 seconds. Toriko and Rin shared a low chuckle at the rambunctiousness of Kushina. The always stoic Kakashi doesn't confuse his name as he just rolled his eyes, picked up a glass of water, and turned towards the group. Nobody knows what he is up to with this little gathering? Nothing, he just gave the instructions and then disappeared without a word. The same for me. Toriko nodded in agreement with everyone else. A moment later Toriko smiled when the familiar chakra signature reached them from the bedroom. Sorry, I was detained. Minato let an apologetic smile appear on his face as he moved closer to the group. You know, you were only 3 seconds from sleeping on the couch, Toriko added cheekily and glanced toward Kushina who nodded and sent an angry look to Minato. So why are we here, sensei? With curiosity in her eyes, Rin looked up at the blonde who started grinning from ear to ear, gathering confused looks from everybody. I asked you to be here because Kushina lost a bet. What the hell are you talking about? Kushina snorted and looked up at him with an annoyed look, but Minato stayed silent. We are here for an idiotic bet? Toriko muttered, giving an angry glance toward the still grinning Minato. Kakashi and Rin stayed silent while frowning. The blonde's smile became almost hysterical and Kushina stared at him with the biggest frown she could manage before she slowly asked. Exactly which bet are you talking about? I'm talking about the bet. The frown slowly melted away from Kushina's face and was replaced by a suspicious glance, earning a confused look from everybody else in the room. You mean the bet? Minato nodded, still grinning like a maniac. No way. Kushina's mouth slowly opened. Her eyes wide and locked onto the blonde. Oh yes. The Sandaime had talked to me yesterday and offered it. Silence filled the room, leaving the still smiling Minato in the middle of the room. Within a blink of an eye and a speed which Minato could also envy, Kushina burst out toward the blonde, clinging onto his neck and sending them down to the floor. Kushina and Minato were the main attraction for the rest of the team, who looked back and forth from each other's confused faces toward the other scene where Kushina was sitting on Minato's chest, laughing hysterically. Toriko cleared his throat to gain their attention with lack of success. The 3 teens patiently waited until the hysterical laughter was reduced into small chuckles and the 2 shinobi finally regained themselves from the floor. Sue, would you mind telling us what the hell that was? Toriko was the first to ask with a wondering tone toward Minato who never stopped smiling. The successor of the 3rd Hokage is chosen by Databane. Kushina answered beside Minato who was holding his side because of the laughter. You! What I thought actually happened. Kakashi threw away his stoic face, his eyes now wide, and he pointed a trembling finger towards the blonde's chest. Toriko moved his head around with a confused look, then focused on Minato, who bowed theatrically with a tawdry hand movement, still grinning. Let me introduce the fourth Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato Namikaze, Minato. After a second's silence, everyone but Minato burst out at the same time, rotating unbelief, congratulations, and questions. Hey, just one at a time. I can't follow you. So that is why you and Orochimaru were summoned yesterday, Kakashi stated as he gathered back his stoic expression on the small visible part of his face. Minato only nodded as a reply. I would die to have seen the face that Snake made when he realized that you are going to be elected instead of him. Minato sent a half-smile toward Kushina. Well, he was stoic on the surface, but I bet my life that he was screaming like a girl on the inside. Why didn't you tell me yesterday? Kushina sent an angry look toward the blonde from her seat next to him. I wanted to announce it when you were together. It's already official? Not yet, Kakashi. The final council meeting will be the day after tomorrow, and the official announcement will still be after weeks. But Sarutobi wants me to participate in the negotiation process, so it seems that I will be out of town a lot in the near future. He wants to hand over his paperwork as soon as possible to enjoy his retirement. The blonde slowly chuckled at the thought. What will happen to the team, Minato-sensei? Rin was the one who finally asked the question which bothered the remaining team members. The blonde shook his head slowly before he could answer. Actually, I don't know yet. Until Sarutobi completely hands over the tasks, we will be officially together. After that, it doesn't matter what will happen, we will remain Team Minato. The elder blonde looked back with a soft, bittersweet smile. He also thought about this. There was no way that his referenced small team would stay together too long. Maybe they would get another sensei, but that wasn't a long-term option. Kakashi was already miles away from Rin's level, and Toriko eyed the teen in front of him. But when he started to turn his head, he quickly averted his eyes to meet a pair of narrowed blue orbs, Kushina's. It's okay. We can meet anytime when we just want, right? Rin answered with a soft smile, and broke the starting depression which slowly started to trail inside the others' heads. Hey, this screams for a celebration, doesn't it? Ramen? Kushina rose from the couch and turned her big smile towards the team, receiving a wide grin from Toriko and positive nods from the others. Toriko wandered slowly on the streets of Konoha, moving without any destination and guided only by pure instinct on the narrow streets that were far away from the city center. Toriko was bored. Minato had been with the Hokage for the last few days, so Toriko barely saw him, and today was the day for him to participate at the council meeting. Kushina and Kakashi were out on a mission, and Rin barricaded herself in the hospital. The boy kicked out a small innocent stone from his way to channel his frustration. Every training ground was already occupied. Most of them were young genins, or jounins, who he didn't know. Since he wasn't in the mood to speak with strangers to join any of them, he ended up wandering back into the village. He reached a red bridge and a warm feeling trailed inside his thoughts. He felt happy as he leaned on the railing and started watching the small stream under his feet. Hokage Minato is going to be the fourth Hokage. A strange mix of emotions ran through him when Minato announced it. Pride, as great as a mountain, and jealousy. It glared at him with his glowing green eyes like a monster under a child's bed in the night. He shook his head. He couldn't place the enormous jealousy he felt toward his brother. He let out a sigh and placed his head onto his hands on the bridge. I need some entertainment. He slowly closed his eyes and spread out his chakra in a thin, imperceptible layer to map his surroundings. A cheeky smile ran across his face when he found what he was looking for. Minato arrived precisely at the time when Sarutobi asked. The Council of Konoha gathered for the special announcement of the third. However, nobody told them the goal, but everybody had his or her own suspicion. The war was almost over and Sarutobi wasn't going to be younger. Perfect time to elect a new Hokage who could lead the village out of the shadows of the war and gain new allies. The two men slowly approached the round meeting room where the council members had already gained their seats. Minato stayed in the background while Sarutobi moved to the highest chair placed in front of the door to the right of his two advisors and old teammate. The clan representatives, the leader of the Shinobi forces, sat around curved tables waiting patiently for the old man to finally settle down. Sarutobi cleared his throat before he started. Thank you for your attendance. I know that this is a hard time with everyone coordinating the rebuilding process. The Hokage left a small space to gather some small nods from the members before he continued. As you were already informed previously, the goal of the meeting is a special announcement. I felt that the time had come for me to step back from my seat. The shinobi in the room stayed calm and silent, already prepared for this in advance. The goal of this meeting is to choose the fourth Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato. Sarutobi let the silence fall onto the room as he eyed the members one by one, watching for any hints. My chosen successor is Namikaze Minato as the Yondaime Hokage of Konoha. Hiruzen moved his hand toward Minato, who started slowly approaching the Sandaime to stand behind his seat. Before we continue, I have to ask if any attendees have another candidate for the position. Sarutobi slowly eyed the members one by one again, waiting for any answers. Someone cleared his throat on his right, and he slowly closed his eyes when it reached his ears. A man raised from his seat, in black and gray robe with black, shaggy hair. The half of his face was covered by bandages and an X-shaped scar sat on his chin. Sarutobi let out a sigh and turned toward the aged shinobi. We are listening to Danzo-san. The man cleared his throat again, slowly eyeing the members one by one. I nominate myself as the Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato. Hiruzen nodded and turned toward the frowning but calm blonde. I would like to give the first word to Danzo-sama, Hokage-sama. Minato bowed politely toward the standing man who nodded and slowly moved toward the center of the curved tables. His stoic expression never left his face. I nominated myself because Namikaze is not suitable for this position. The war isn't over yet, and we should prepare our forces and straighten our position as the strongest hidden village of the elemental nations. He is the student of Jiraiya, the toad who was the student of our current Hokage, known as a liberal leader and unfortunately not a strong one. I'm confident that Jiraiya passed the same lecture on to his own student. The other Kages are all forceful and fearsome leaders, and Konoha can't allow herself to show any weakness in times like this. Danzo turned around to face each council member, and the stoic face of Sarutobi, carefully avoiding the emotionless face of Minato, while he let his sentences settle down before he continued. Konoha maybe will come out from the war on the winning side, but you already know what the price was. Dozens of young and talented shinobis died on the battlefields because Sarutobi didn't send more troops, despite the fact that Konoha's genin forces were not used. Sarutobi frowned at the statement, but he stayed in total silence while watching the man with curiosity in his eyes. Eventually he cleared his throat. Danzo-sama, I would like to remind you that the purpose of this meeting is to elect our new Hokage and not to criticize my war tactics. A half-small smile appeared on a man's face at the right of Sarutobi. He was the Jonin commander, the head of the Nara clan and also the strategy advisor of the Sandaime. He had his dark hair tied up into a spiky ponytail with 2 long scars running across his face. It is essential to criticize your strategy, because if our new leader is Namikaze, he will have inherited the same aspects. We have a powerful weapon, a great tool amongst our leaders, and it wasn't used properly. We have the power of a bijou, and the Ninetails vessel wasn't sent to direct battle during the years of the Third Shinobi War. We cannot allow Konoha to become weak after the war, or else she will be an easy prey to the other nations. We have to reinforce the current soft laws and straighten ourselves with a forceful and experienced leader, and not someone almost out of the academy. Danzo slowly turned around one more time before he left the center of the table and moved back to his seat. The blonde felt his blood start to boil when Danzo talked about Kushina as a weapon, a mere tool of the war. He hardened himself and calmed down his increasing rage, concentrating to suppress the rising killing intent toward Danzo. Sarutobi nodded toward Minato, who replaced himself in the center after he let out a long breath. He politely bowed one more time to every direction. It is true that the war isn't over yet. The hard part is just starting with the negotiations, which could give lifelong enemies or also new alliances. The Kages and the representatives need a well-known name and not a faceless shadow, who almost never appeared in public nor took any real part of the previous fights. Minato let out a small silence before he continued, facing the narrow eyes of Danzo. The responsibilities of a Kage are to sacrifice everything for his village, and it couldn't be done from the background. I was at the battlefields, I saw the enemies and met the Kages. Maybe I am young, but I am not inexperienced in the life of the shinobi by watching it from the shadows. The strategy of the Third Ninja War was made to save as many lives as we just could. If we had sent out the newly formed genin teams without any real experience, they would be dead. Yes, maybe some of our higher-ranked shinobi would have survived, but it would have come at the cost of our next generation. He turned around again. Danzo-sama said that Konoha needs a forceful leader who will lead the village into a completely military state. The Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato should serve the welfare of his people, and not the other way around. Shinobi are not tools of power. There are enough names on the memorial stone. Konoha needs someone who will lead the village out from the darkness of war and not deeper into it. You speak about yourself as the light, Danzo stated calmly without any expression. I am the yellow flash of Konoha. I am more the light which warms up the leaves than the roots growing under the shadows. Danzo's only visible eye twitched at retort. A real shinobi remains anonymous. Hiding in the shadows, waiting patiently, that is the true form of a ninja and not open to the word, spreading around his. Maybe the shinobi world needs to change, Danzo-sama. Changes that someone who is raised by the old world cannot afford. Danzo didn't make any comment and Minato tapped his own shoulder in his mind. Thank you for your time. Minato bowed once again and moved back to his original place next to Hiruzen, who by then was slowly eyeing the members again. If there are no more questions or comments, Sarutobi waited for a few seconds, waiting for any movement. When nothing came, he nodded, more to himself than to the council members. I hereby open the vote. I, Sarutobi Hiruzen, as the Sandaime Hokage of Konoha and the leader of the Sarutobi clan, support Namikaze Minato as the Yondaime Hokage. The old Hokage turned to his right, waiting for the other members to vote. I, Naro Shikaka, as the representation of the Nara clan and as the Jonin commander of Konoha shinobi forces, stand for Namikaze Minato as the fourth Hokage. Anbu will follow Namikaze Minato. The blonde let a smile spread across his face when he heard the short statement of the Anbu captain. And Anbu will always stay Anbu. Never out of the line. As the delegate of the Uchiha clan, I, Uchiha Fugaku, support Shimura Danzo as the new leader of the village. I, Shimura Danzo, as the head of the council, vote for myself. The old shinobi started without even opening his eyes. The Akimichi clan supports Namikaze Minato as the Yondaime. Yamanaka Inoichi, as the representative of the Yamanaka clan, supports Namikaze Minato. Inoichi sent a warm smile toward the blonde. I, Hyuga Hayashi, as the Hyuga clan's leader, voted for Namikaze Minato-san. The Aburane clan of Konoha will also support Namikaze Minato as the Yondaime Hokage of Konoha. The Inuzuka clan also votes for Namikaze Minato. Mito Kato Hamura, as the advisor of the Sandaime Hokage, will vote for Namikaze Minato. Minato suppressed a chuckle as he saw Danzo's eye twitch and his stoic expression leave his face, replaced by a frown. You didn't think about this, did you? That your old friends would vote for me, heh? Old Warhawk. A smirk formed inside his mind, but he regained himself to not let it spread across his face. Udatane Koharu, advisor of the third Hokage, will support Namikaze Minato. Sarutobi Hiruzen let out a relieved sigh and he let a small smile spread on his face. Then the decision is made. The next leader of the village, the Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, will be Namikaze Minato. The young teen walked on the cobble without any noise as he passed by a high bamboo fence. Distant chuckling could be heard all over the place, echoing from the panels back and forth. The pale smell of sulfur encompassed the place around the steaming water spots around the curving cobble. Torika moved toward the end of the passage, when he heard another giggle behind a big camellia bush. It was deeper, though still childish. A frown appeared on his face as he realized that someone was able to almost perfectly hide from his senses. He turned around and slowly approached the bush to sneak a peek behind it. A cocky smile spread on his face, and he moved toward the crunching form next to the fences without any noise. The teen stopped next to the white-haired man and sat down cross-legs, while he ran wine chakra onto his trigger finger's pad and pushed it onto the bamboo to lean toward the newly made small hole. Anything interesting? Oh yes, the blonde in the corner a second ago lost her towel, and when she, the white-haired, middle-aged man's head flung toward the teen, to face the profile of a head, mostly shrouded with brown locks peeking into the baths by a new hole. I was occupied, I think. I didn't sense you. I'm that good old man. I'm not old. The brown-haired teen didn't turn toward him. Instead, he just shrugged, his eyes still attached to the hole. You are just an old pervert. The white-haired man eyed the teen from head to toe carefully, waiting for him to turn around to finally face him, but he didn't move. Look who is speaking. He narrowed his eyes as he felt the thin, almost insensible layer of chakra on his face and hair, the obvious sign of a henge. I'm just a healthy and curious teenager while you are an old pervert. The white-haired man snorted and turned back to his own hole. What's the henge for? The teen shrugged, still focused on the inside. Incognito, the man chuckled at the statement, but he stopped when he felt the approaching presence of somebody else on a distant tree, lurking behind the shadows of the leaves. And I thought I could be by myself a little bit more. Man, I had just arrived, the man muttered quietly under his mouth to himself. The teen raised an eyebrow without turning around. What are you talking about? About my masked company. Oh, Anbu-chan belongs to me. She is my babysitter. I thought I finally threw her off 10 minutes ago, but it seems she found me this time pretty quickly. The teen waved a hand toward the tree without turning around, earning a frustrated groan from the tree and a raised eyebrow from the white-haired man. Anbu guard for a teenager? Toraku actually wanted to measure his Anbu's patience by waiting for her intervention. He was bored and he could think only about his favorite engagement. Annoying his Anbu guard in many ways was always a good way to while away some time, and it was also enjoyable. However, sitting next to this stranger made his heart ache with the mix of sorrow and happiness continuously stinging his insides. But it was still a pleasant feeling. They just sat side by side for long minutes without any interruption. The only noise that broke the pleasant silence between them was the small giggles from the white-haired man next to him, making Toraku smile and his heart to warm up. He focused his senses more to his companion than to the naked girls behind the fence, listening to his heartbeat, inhaling his scent of distant lands and something which reminded him of wet soil. His gentle and warm chakra signature continuously and slowly stroked his insides, forcing the boy to relax and his muscles to almost melt from the feeling. He slowly closed his eyes, completely forcing out everything else from his mind about the outer world and his surroundings. Complete peace fell upon him as the last remnants of the outside world left his senses. Someone cleared his throat only centimeters behind them, forcing Toraku to turn around slowly. However, he already knew what he would see, an angry Minato, his arms folded in front of his chest, watching them with narrowed eyes. Hi! Toraku raised his hands behind his head to scratch the back of his head in embarrassment, but a cheeky smile still spread across his face. I'm not surprised by your behavior, Jiraiya, but I never thought you found any company. Toraku glanced quickly towards the white-haired man who didn't move from his hole, his eyes still fixed on the other side of the bamboo fence. Minato, you are too stiff, you should relax. Want a hole too? Just like in the good old times. The almost Hokage felt the increasing heat in his face as the blood flooded into his cheeks. What? Toraku snapped his head toward the white-haired man with wide eyes, then glanced back and forth between the two men. Minato, a closet pervert. Do not crush my reputation. Minato put his head into one of his hands, shaking it slowly, desperately trying to make the moment undone. The white-haired man softly chuckled and finally turned around and stood up from the hole to face Minato. He moved next to him and placed his hand onto his shoulders and finally had a chance to observe his peeking companion. A young teen rose up from the grass, maybe in his 18. The henge covered his whole body flawlessly. The teen observed him carefully. The chocolate-brown orbs moved from his long white spiky hair tied together on his back, then dwelled on his forehead protector. The boy tilted his head to the side as his eyes moved toward the two red lines running down his face. Minato let out a sigh and waved a hand toward the teen. Come, I'll give you a lift. Jiraiya felt as one of his eyebrows moved up in his surprise, eyeing the teen with increased curiosity. It's okay, I can walk. Minato only rolled his eyes and waved his hand once more, forcing the teen to move closer after a sigh. The three males disappeared from the baths, and with a second delay they were in the middle of the Hokage's office facing Sarutobi. Hokage-sama. Toraku bowed politely while feeling only a distant dull in his head. He turned to Minato, curious about his plans and the reasons why he even wanted him here. It's good to see you again, old man. The white-haired man moved toward the desk and the village leader, earning a raised eyebrow from the teen. The same for you, my old friend. I thought you wouldn't return until next week. The white-haired man just shrugged. I picked them up at the bathhouses. They were enjoying the sight. Sarutobi moved his eyes to the teen who was scratching his cheeks. Chuckling, Hiruzen's mouth moved to a knowing smile. The white-haired man raised an eyebrow and turned towards Minato. How do you even know I was in the town? I had just arrived. Actually, I didn't know. I went to pick up that idiot over there. Toriku raised an eyebrow. And that was why you made a statement about personal privacy. What if I was, for example, with a girl? Minato only rolled his eyes as a reply. Drop the henge. It's annoying. I won't. Toriku frowned and turned away from him as a childish response, already sulking. Toriku, drop the henge. Why do you even have that on anyway? The blonde snorted while turning toward Minato with an odd expression on his face. To look after your reputation. The teen sent a cheeky and knowing smile toward the blonde, underlining the word reputation in reference to the previous comment of the white-haired man at the baths, before he moved his hands to release the jutsu. Minato again only rolled his eyes in response, and a soft chuckle came from the third Hokage. Jiraiya's right eye twitched as Toriku's henge disappeared. He turned to face the blonde boy, realizing that he had the same azure blue eyes as his old student. His eyes ran over the whisker marks on Toriku's cheeks, observing the familiar features of his face, the line of his jugular, his nose, his bright hair. Everything screamed at him that this was Minato's relative. Toriku, I would like to introduce my sensei. Odoroki Toriku. The young boy bowed politely, watching the white-haired man with curious eyes. Sensei? Minato was trained by a pervert? Before he could continue his thoughts, the man jumped into a theatrical pose, moving his hands like he was in a kabuki performance. Toriku raised his right eyebrow until his hairline and his brain black out by the sight. I am the toad of Mount Myaboku, the great sage Jiraiya, mugger of lonely woman hearts, savior of the vulnerable. Toriku rolled his eyes and folded his arms in front of his chest. You are still just an old pervert. The sage's eyes narrowed at the statement. I'm not old. And you had also peaked, brat. I'm a healthy teenager with rampaging hormones, and you didn't even deny that you are a pervert. Databao. Toriku shouted back at the man, pointing a finger toward him. No, I'm not a pervert. I'm a super pervert. The teen turned to Minato with a raised questioning eyebrow, who was by then holding his head in his hands, slowly shaking it in disbelief. And you told me that I could be an idiot sometimes. Cocky little brat, Jiraiya muttered and folded his arms in front of his chest. The yellow flash of Konoha let out a long, weary sigh, and another chuckle could be heard from the leader of the village. Hey, how was the meeting? Toriku turned toward Minato when he suddenly realized why he was even looking for him. We will talk later, Toriku. Minato didn't directly answer the question but sent a wide grin toward him. The teen nodded and grinned back in understanding, then bowed to the others before he left the room. He was followed by a gaze from Jiraiya, who turned immediately toward Minato when the doors closed. Explain. Who is this boy? The almost Hokage moved toward a chair in front of the desk, sat down, and turned towards his sensei, resting his chin on his hands, gathering his thoughts while Sarutobi stoically puffing from his pipe, filling the room with the sweet scent of herbs. Meanwhile, Jiraiya moved to the other chair, removing the large scroll from his back, and sat down facing the two men, waiting curiously for the explanation of what he saw minutes before. A little more than 5 weeks ago, my team found him on a training ground, wounded, appearing from nowhere. He was unconscious for almost a week, and when he finally woke up, he knocked out 7 well-trained shinobi with a chakra burst to dismiss a non-existing genjutsu. Minato stopped and narrowed his eyes before he continued. When Sarutobi and I arrived at the hospital, he blacked out again when he saw us. Well, that is a quite understandable reaction. You are fearsome opponents. Minato shook his head. No, he wasn't afraid of us. Sarutobi didn't interfere, only nodded and exhaled another puff of smoke while observing the raised eyebrow of the. When he woke up again on the same day, he didn't remember anything. He lost his memories, and he is now one of the shinobi of Konoha for 2.5 weeks. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes and frowned. He knew very well what that could mean. Any suspicious movement? No, he gets a checkup once a week with Inoichi Yamanaka, but until now we found nothing. Actually, so much so that there is neither sign of head trauma, nor any sign of a jutsu that could cause his memory loss. Our little friend until now showed only remarkable abilities and nothing suspicious. However, some special circumstances are pointing towards something bigger than just a mere accidental appearance from nowhere. Sarutobi stated calmly, eyeing Minato carefully. The sage leaned forward to his knees, closer to his old student. Based on the blood tests, he is my brother or most likely my half-brother. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes, watching the blonde with wandering eyes. Precautions are prepared, I guess? Minato nodded. Continuous ANBU surveillance, and he was joined to my own team and also accommodated next to my house to be near if something happens. Umbu? That doesn't bother him too much, as I saw. Indeed. Torikoku-kun has a remarkable sensing ability, and a habit to annoy his ANBU guards with his skills. Or anyone near him. Sarutobi moved his mouth into a small smile, chewing his pipe with a wondering look on his face. I saw that. Cheeky little brat. Jiraiya snorted and laughed loudly. Still, if there is a chance that he is after your life, why did you place him near you? Because we have doubts that anyone else can handle him easily. Jiraiya burrowed his eyebrows in a continuous thin line. We made an assessment, and he achieved the rank of Chunin, but most of his true abilities are still hidden. However, everything points towards the fact that he was an S-class shinobi before he lost his memories. Bullshit. He is still just a kid. His chakra coils are as well developed as yours, mine, or Sarutobi's. He has more chakra than the three of us combined, and he could handle at least 3 chakra elements easily. At least, we have already seen 3, and I'm not ruling out that it could be more. Also, he completed one of my barrier seals in less than half an hour. A barrier I've been working on for more than a month. He completed it, and then also increased its effectiveness after another 25 minutes. The felt as his jaw dropped and his eyes widened after Minato finished. You are just joking, aren't you? The two men stayed completely calm, forcing the sage to lean back in his chair. Shitsuku no Her gained a genius or a ticking bomb. Minato only nodded without any word, and Jiraiya started to scratch his chin as he lost in his thoughts. Can I see his personal file, or do you want me to be involved in this much? Actually, I would like to ask you much more. The yellow flash sent a smile back at him and nodded toward Hiruzen. I have chosen my next successor. Oh, so you finally brought yourself to retire, old man. Jiraiya chuckled. So, who is the next victim of the village council? Sarutobi smiled and pointed a finger toward the blonde. Can I congratulate you already, Minato-chan? The blonde chuckled and waved a hand. You can count on the clan leaders and mostly every shinobi. The only problem could be Danzo. Sarutobi started calmly in Minato's side and closed his fingers together to lean on them. I know Danzo. He definitely could be a big problem. Minato lost in his thoughts for a moment, then blinked and turned toward Jiraiya. I need your support in Torika's case. If something goes wrong, I need someone who can handle him since I won't be always there next to him in the future. You can count on my help, my friend. They shared a warm smile. I'm glad. We have to discuss a lot of things now. Jiraiya raised a finger before Minato could say anything more. But first I want to lay down one very important thing. I won't take over Team Minato. I don't have any problem with the small girl, but Kakashi annoys me to hell with his rule fanaticism, and I won't be the sitting target of Obito's idiocy plus that cheeky Torika kid. I'm sure the two brats hit it off together, and I won't play the babysitter role for 4 teenagers. The sage folded his arms together in front of his chest, but he reversed the motion and frowned when he saw Minato's face frozen and his eyes darkened. Minato? Uchiha Obito was killed in our mission at the Kanobi Bridge not a week before Toriku appeared. Jiraiya looked back at his one-time student with worry on his face. Gaki, sorry. I didn't know about that. It's okay. You were out of town for 2 months. Minato let out a sigh and ran his hands through his blonde hair, gathering his feelings and his thoughts. I'll need your help in 2 things. First, we have a very feasible theory about Toriku's sudden appearance, and we will need your spy network. The evidence points towards a wandering Uchiha with an active Sharingan. We need every information on who it could be and every available help to find out his identity. We have an unknown rogue Uchiha, or someone stole a Kekkai Genkai from an unknown corpse without our and the clan's knowledge. You mean someone got his hands on a Sharingan and had it implanted? Minato only nodded. I see. And the other thing would be to have an eye on Toriku, isn't it? Indeed. I know the team won't stay together, and it also won't be too healthy since the power levels are now too spread open, but I would like to ask you to replace me as the sensei of Team Minato for a while. It would be the easiest way to inspect him continuously." Jiraiya let out a sigh and rubbed his forehead. "I told you, they will finish me off." They changed a lot. Kakashi lost his fanaticism and Rin, well, she is the same kind girl. Toriku is a loud-mouthed brat like Obito was, but he is also a very interesting young shinobi with honorable goals. Jiraiya only snorted. What honorable goals could a teenage boy have? Minato let a knowing smile on his face, earning a raised eyebrow from Jiraiya. "Read his file. I'll wait for your reply, of course. And this is not an order, this is a request." "Hey Gaki, you aren't already wearing that hat, you know, don't be so full of yourself." Minato only chuckled and waved a hand in response to his old sensei and disappeared from the room, leaving the two men alone. "Blondes are always problematic," Jiraiya sighed, and Sarutobi chuckled at the statement knowingly. Minato and his late sensei were sitting together at a small stand, 2 small cups in front of them and a bottle of fine sake on the counter between them. The sun's last beams still burned their back in a comfortable way, creating long shadows on the counter. "So, it's time for a proper celebration, I think." Jiraiya raised his hands with the cup, waiting for Minato to mimic the movement. "To our fearless, wise, and flaxen new leader." Minato rolled his eyes in annoyance but raised his hands with a soft smile on his face, and drank his drink in one fast shot. A shudder ran across his spine as the alcohol flew down and reached his stomach. He snorted at the feeling, but still enjoyed the aftereffects when a minute later a pleasant warm feeling started to spread from his inside toward his weary brain. "I needed that one." "I'm always aware of what is good for you, Gaki." Minato leaned his head to the side, waiting for the crapping voice as the joints snapped. "Did you read the file?" Minato filled another round without looking or asking his companion, knowing that he wouldn't reject the fine liquid. Jiraiya slowly raised his cup and slurped a small amount of sake before he answered. "I did." Minato looked back at the sage, waiting for more, but nothing came out from the old Sanin's mouth. "And? How are you handling him?" Minato sipped from his own cup before he answered. "In the beginning it was easy. He was a teen who suddenly appeared from nowhere, with a very charming personality and resemblance. After Sarutobi revealed our connection, it changed. I tried to deny my attachment to him and distance, but you couldn't." Jiraiya finished his sentence and Minato nodded. "I still don't know what I should do with him." "I see." Jiraiya drank his remaining sake and turned toward the blonde. "I found something strange in his file." Minato snorted and laughed. "Only one thing? That boy is an enigma, a living and walking surprise. He really deserves his given surname." "It is about his memory fragment." Minato raised an eyebrow and turned toward his sensei with a serious look on his face, who is now feeling for something in his bag. "I didn't show it to anyone yet, and I wanted you to be the first one who got it." "Got what?" Minato asked. Jiraiya finally found what he was looking for, and he pulled out a small angled object, wrapped in soft brown canvas. He slowly put it down onto the counter and started to free it from the textile, to review a small brown book. "I finally found a publisher for my first book. This is the first copy, and the real print will start next week." Minato, confused, slowly raised an eyebrow in a questioning manner. "And how is it connected with the memory fragment?" "I wanted you to be the first one to read it and give an honest opinion about it. So I would like to ask you to read it." Minato grasped the small book and examined the jacket. Then he slowly opened it and saw his sensei's picture on the first page. He was younger in it. His face was smoother. His hair was shorter and not so shaggy, and the 2 red lines which now ran through his whole face were only touching his cheeks. A small smile appeared on his face as he ran his fingers along the picture while the scent of fresh paper and the fine ink gently stroked his nose. "I still don't get it." "Just read the book and you will understand." "Why don't you just tell me?" "Sorry Gaki, no spoilers." "Jiraiya, this is serious." The just shrugged and sipped another from his sake. "Now start reading. We haven't got that much time, you know." Minato let out a defeated moan and a sigh before thumbing to the first page. He was silent for the remaining hour. Only low snorts and moans left his mouth when he read 1 or 2 scenes. He moved only to slip some sake from his cup, which, to his surprise, was always full. It didn't matter how much he had already drunk thanks to Jiraiya's hard work and vigilant eyes. After a long hour, he finally leaned back and shut the small book to turn toward his sensei. So? Minato turned his head upwards, thinking for a minute before he answered with a smirk. It's great. And some of the scenes are familiar. I'm sure it is based on your own life. Well, you think so? Thank you. Jiraiya scratched his cheek in embarrassment, and he felt his cheeks turn to a reddish color. I like how the protagonist refused to give up at the end. Minato scratched his chin and turned toward Jiraiya, flipping the book back to the last pages. However. So you also noticed. It's weird. Like he quoted word to word from this book. Those are Nagato's words. Minato raised an eyebrow at the statement. I wrote this book during the Second Great Shinobi War. I made 2 scripts and nobody knows about this. I left one at the publisher and the other one at Amigakure with Nagato when I left. Jiraiya sipped once more from his sake before he refilled his own and also Minato's cup. And this means that he is probably from Amigakure. What is more, he knew Nagato at some point. I thought they died. Minato frowned. Indeed, and it could explain why he talked about a legacy. So you think he was his student? Jiraiya shrugged. Comrade is a more possible option. They would be now how old? Around 20? It would also explain a lot of other things. I am not receiving much information from there. I only know that currently it is led by Hanzo. AIM had been isolated completely since the Second Shinobi War ended. That could explain why we had never heard of him if he is as capable as the file said. An S-class shinobi never stays out of battles for very long, especially not in wartime like this. Minato gently stroked his chin, wondering about the possibility. What if he works for Hanzo? I doubt that, Gaki. With that legacy, moreover, Hanzo is a man of power, and by the last reports about him, he gained quite the paranoia, constantly fearing being assassinated. I doubt that he would allow for anybody near him to become powerful enough to threaten his life, or his seat as a leader. Nagato has the Rinnegan. He was able to use every chakra in nature. He could teach him how to use more than 1 or 2. Torika said that he felt like he didn't have a family. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow at the statement, not finding any connections with the theme. When we know about our relationship, he told me that every time he needs something, the information would just pop up from his basic knowledge, but he found nothing about family. During the Second Great Ninja War, Konoha and the other nations left a lot of refugees and orphans for AIM. Jiraiya nodded as he realized the connections. From the elemental countries, I would absolutely rule out IWA. With that face of his, he would be killed in his early years. You gain too many enemies in stone. However, Jiraiya made a wondering face before he continued his thoughts. I have one option in my mind for stone demonstration. They know that we are able to realize the blood relation, and killing one of your relatives before sending his bloodied body to Konoha, it could greatly affect the morale of our troops. They somehow found the boy and they had sent him here to demonstrate that they could kill a Namikaze. That could be an option. However, if that was the case, it was an absolute failure. First, he is alive. Second, they send him to one of our training grounds, not to the middle of the town where it is crowded with people. Furthermore, gaining a new and strong shinobi is just raising morale. So, if it was them, we should be grateful. Maybe it wasn't willful, just something went wrong. Maybe they didn't count on his healing ability and misjudged our security seals. Jiraiya shrugged, while Minato lost in his thoughts before he continued after a minute of silence. Is definitely out. When we fought with Killer Bee, they didn't recognize him, and I doubt the brother of the Raikage would not know a powerful shinobi, and a seal master like him, especially since Bee is a. His abilities with wind chakra could still point towards Suna, and we should also count with Kiri. Minato stated with a wondering look on his face. A seal master from the Bloody Mist? That sounds like some science fiction. Jiraiya shook his head and Minato chuckled softly before it died down, and the blonde let out a weary sigh. We are still just poking in the dark, Minato stated with a soft, weary tone, hovering his fingers around his small cup of sake on the desk. That is true. However, if he is a part of a well-defined assassination plan from any of the elemental countries, they somehow put their hands on your lost relative, trained him, wounded him, sent him here with a stolen Sharingan, evaded all of our top-level security, only to insinuate him into your favor, and we're aware about your upcoming election as Hokage. That is just too complicated. The small countries wouldn't make a profit from your assassination. Suna has its own financial problems to concentrate on. The Raikage has also just taken over his seat. Kiri is too unstable to perform this complex plan, and I doubt the old Inoki of Stone would bother himself this much only to get rid of you, despite your reputation. Amigekure still is the most possible option with its complete isolation, which could also hide someone with a Sharingan. It is more possible than any of the others and it gives us answers, while the others give only more questions. The correct one is usually the most plausible one. They stayed in silence for several long minutes while slowly drinking their sake. Each dived inside their own thoughts, racing through the options of their small brainstorming in their minds. You know, that boy reminds me of you when you were at his age. Minato raised an eyebrow, and looked back with a curious look on his face. Powerful, cheeky and reckless. Just like you a decade ago. The blonde rolled his eyes and diversified the conversation. Will you accept my request? Jiraiya smiled back at his old student. Of course. You could announce Team Gaki's birth, but... He raised one of his fingers and Minato sighed, fearing in advance what he would demand. No lame missions. I am one of the fearsome toad sage of Mountain Myoboku, and I will definitely not chase stupid cats, or do groceries, or anything below a level. Minato frowned. I will consider a C level limit. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes, watching Minato in silence for a minute, but in the end just shrugged. Escorting is fine, but no lame missions. Minato only smiled and nodded with a smile on his face. I need to know the shrimp's current level, so a small spar would be necessary. Especially in Toriku's case. I want to see him in action. The reports were detailed enough, but I trust only in my own eyes. Don't be afraid, I think he is eager for a little exercise. Minato chuckled, thinking about the grin Toriku had when he asked for a spar. Jiraiya nodded and got his pack and fixed his giant scroll to his back while placing some money on the counter. I'm going. I also need to visit the snake's nest, and I doubt I will find him in a good mood. Minato nodded and waved a hand toward his sensei. Then tomorrow at Training Ground 20 at 10. The only raised a hand in understanding and stepped out into the dark night, leaving the blonde alone with the remaining sake. The low sound of blunt footsteps echoed faintly in a long, dark passageway as a dark figure slowly walked toward a great door with carved intarsia. The doors slowly opened without any noise as the man almost reached them, but he didn't have to change the flow of his steps. He stepped into a round office-like room with a big mahogany table in the center of it. The figure moved towards it and sat down without a noise and slowly closed his eyes. Report. A form appeared in front of the table, crouching, facing the pale floor. Jiraiya-sama returned to town and has already contacted him. The dark figure only nodded, but didn't move, nor opened his eyes. Keep up the observation and continuously report every move. Dismissed. The figure straightened himself and bowed to the figure. As you wish, Danzo-sama. The masked man disappeared from the room, and Danzo finally opened his one visible eye and fixed it on the empty room in front of him, without a word, lost in his thoughts. Toriku jumped out from his wondering thoughts when he felt a snap on his back wobbling on the street, and a moment later he could feel a familiar chakra signature at his back when he gained back his balance. Don't do this, idiot. The teen murmured, sweeping some non-existing dirt from his shirt. I thought you were a sensing genius. Minato grinned back when he moved next to him. I wasn't counting on an ambush in the middle of the village. He moved his hands into his pockets, glancing curiously at his older companion on his side while they slowly walked down the empty street. Minato languidly rolled his shoulders and glanced at the teen. What are you doing out this late, Toriku? Nothing. Just wandering around, and I'm old enough to be up this late. Toriku shrugged. Minato chuckled and placed his hands into his blue pants, mimicking the teen who continuously watched him from the corner of his eyes with a wondering face. You are drunk. I'm also a grown man. Minato shrugged and Toriku rolled his eyes. So? How was it? The council meeting? Done. It was a pain in the ass, but it was successful. It's official from today. Minato grinned at the blonde. So, Hokage-sama, what will be your first order? Toriku smirked at Minato, who snorted as he answered. Don't call me that. I will get enough teasing from Kushina. Hokage-sama Toriku replied with a singing crippling voice, earning another, this time quite painful snap on his back. Hey, that hurt. Don't hit the citizens, it's rude, you know. What kind of Hokage will you be? Bullying innocent people. Minato let out a soft chuckle and dropped behind a few steps, watching the murmuring and cursing teen from behind. He let a small, warm smile spread across his face as he stopped for a moment and closed his eyes. Thanks, Kushina. Hey, are you coming, or will you stay there, daydreaming about your fancy hat? Minato chuckled and caught up with Toriku, clasping his left arm around his shoulders. You are still an idiot. Oto. Toriku rolled his eyes, but on the inside he couldn't feel with the warm feeling on his shoulders. He sent a kind smile toward Minato as they walked toward the almost empty streets. Chapter 9. Promise of a Toad. The breeze was slowly stroking the grass on the training ground in the forenoon sunlight, forcing the living sea to wave gracefully like the never-ending emerald ocean. At the shores of the green sea, 4 figures were sitting next to a cliff, waiting impatiently for the remaining member of the team to finally appear. I told you to grab him at his home, Toriku muttered behind his folded arms, which rested on his tucked knees. Minato only rolled his eyes in response. We could start without him. Kakashi can wait. You promised me a spar, Aniki. I didn't. Yes, you did. No. If you're going to continue this, then I'm going to place you 2 under a genjutsu until Kakashi arrives. Geez. Act your age, Jiraiya muttered in the background while Rin's soft chuckle could be heard behind the irritated blonde teen. Toriku only muttered something incoherent in response and pulled out a scroll, ink and a soft calligraphy brush from his vest's pouch. What are you doing? Minato leaned over his shoulder to examine the open scroll in his lap. I'm bored and I want to finish this seal. Another barrier seal? Sort of. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow and moved closer to sneak a peek at the scroll. That's a trap, the Toad Sannin had stated calmly, and pointed toward the pattern with a grimace on his face. And it won't work with this wonky design. Toriku narrowed his eyes and turned toward the... It will. I'm not an amateur. Why is the pervert even here? Jiraiya snorted and turned away from the blonde, sulking like a 5-year-old. To watch you spar. Minato slowly shook his head, but his eyes were fixed on the fine design. It was unusual as almost all of his previous works, but he was certain that would work. A confused expression appeared on his fine features when his eyes moved to the upper part of the design. What will it do with the captives? Toriku made a cocky smile and turned back to his scroll. It will suck their chakra coils dry. Then why do you use the lightning here and there? It makes no sense to me. Minato had pointed to several parts of the seal, frowning in his confusion. That is for a little surprise, he said with a wicked tone, chuckling to himself and earning a raised eyebrow from Jiraiya. Minato slowly stroked his chin, eyeing the design carefully from stroke to stroke, lost in his thoughts for a long minute. I see now, that is quite a massive trap. Toriku only shrugged, then suddenly flung his head to the side. It was really time for that. Toriku muttered and quickly took away his sealing kit and moved a few steps away from the others. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow and his mouth fell open when next to Toriku, Kakashi appeared with a sunshine and he was immediately greeted with a snap on his crown. You are late. Kakashi rubbed his throbbing head and sent an angry look to Toriku while he moved toward the small group, greeting everyone around. Jiraiya-sama. Kakashi made a small bow toward the Sannin, who answered with a nod and turned to Minato. So, can we start? Start what exactly? Kakashi raised a questioning eyebrow. You got your rematch, Kakashi. An unexpected smirk spread across Kakashi's always stoic face under his mask, and he turned toward the blonde teen, who had just raised an eyebrow and folded his arms in front of his chest. 5 minutes later, the 2 teens were facing each other in the center of the clearing. Kakashi moved to stance with an unfolded Sharingan, while Toriku remained still, carelessly and confidently watching his partner. Sharingan? Jiraiya glanced toward Minato, who just nodded in return, but he couldn't miss Rin's darkening eyes and the sad expression on her mostly gentle and kind face. I see. The let out a sigh and turned toward the 2 teens and shouted out, "Stay in the clearing." Toriku just waved a hand in response. So, can we start, Kakashi-kun? The teen chirped with a singing and cocky voice to his tense partner, but he only nodded. The blonde let a smirk on his face, and he jumped in front of Kakashi, immediately sending a kick toward his face, turning silkily like a dancer, and a kunai appeared in his hands from his weapon pouch in the next moment. Suddenly 2 clones appeared next to him, forcing the joining to back off from the center and the preponderance. The scarecrow had sent a shuriken toward the nearest clone, who puffed out from existence when the sharp metal connected with his stomach. His place was immediately filled with another clone, who jumped toward Kakashi only to repeat his predecessor's fate a minute later by another shuriken. "No hand signs?" Jiraiya stated calmly, watching the intense taijutsu, his eyes fixed mostly on Toriku's movements. "No. Nor does he use signs with any of the wind element ninjutsu he showed until now." Jiraiya only hemmed in response as he watched the blonde perform a perfect backflip, to land on his right arm and send a kunai toward Kakashi with his left hand without a stop in his flow, before he jumped to his feet and immediately launched himself toward the again. "He's got an interesting fighting style." "Indeed. A total mixture. Effective and hardly predictable, and he improved a lot in his taijutsu. Last time Kakashi could countervail him without his Sharingan, by speed and also by the effectiveness of his style." "You think so?" The 2 men twist backward to face a smirking Toriku, who stepped between the 2 men and folded his arms in front of his chest, eyeing the ongoing taijutsu battle with the newly appeared 5 clones. "I've been practicing a lot lately, you know. I uncovered a lot of new moves, and with that my speed also increased a lot. But I feel something big is still missing from my fighting style." Minato frowned and hit the teen hard on the head, who disappeared with a loud puff, leaving behind a small, puffy chakra cloud between the 2 men. A furious snort could be heard almost immediately from the middle of the clearing, and the blondes around Kakashi who weren't occupied with their opponent turned their heads and looked at Minato with an indignant expression. One of the nearest pointed a finger toward him, his eyes narrowed and his eyebrows moved to one coherent line. "Hey! Don't bully the clones. There was a reason he was there." The yelling Toriku disappeared when Kakashi sent a kunai into his chest. Jiraiya chuckled at the scene and glanced at Minato from the corner of his eyes. Kakashi jumped backwards and ran his hands through a chain of seals, to slash his hands into the earth as soon as he made contact with the soil. Raitun Jibashi, lightning style, earth flash. The ground filled with electricity. The attack ran through the clearing with a loud chirping sound, dismissing the clones in its way, moving toward the last group of blondes. 2 clones grabbed Toriku's hand and threw him up in the air to avoid the attack before it could reach him, flying gracefully toward the still crouching Kakashi. When the jutsu hit them, they jerked, but after a moment they disappeared with a puff of smoke. Toriku in the meanwhile ran through some hand seals in the midair, breathed a fair amount of air and spit out a massive amount of water toward Kakashi within a blink of an eye. Suitun, Daibakufu no Jutsu. Water release, great waterfall technique. The water hit him before he could release his own jutsu. When the water contacted him, the lightning chakra ran through his own system, forcing Kakashi's muscles to squeeze. Fortunately, he was able to release the attack after a moment, but the feeling was enough to distract his senses and numb his muscles. Toriku landed gracefully in front of him with a loud splash and a puddle of remaining water. Kakashi narrowed his eyes and disappeared with a puff of smoke, leaving behind a frowning Toriku, to face with the log. He stiffened as he felt a hand around his ankles and his eyes met with a probably grinning lightning clone. Shit! The clone exploded into millions of electric sparks which were now racing inside his nerves, forcing his muscles to clench painfully and his teeth and eyes to cling tightly. When the release finally died down, Toriku wobbled a step backward and grabbed his hair and ruffled it hysterically. I hate when lightning releases, you shrimp. I'm going to beat you into the ground for that, you got that? The blonde teen calmed himself down, moved to a relaxed stance and closed his eyes to sniff the air. A questioning grimace appeared on his face, then the 2 men stiffened and Rin flinched at the shore of the clearing when a massive amount of chakra reached them as Toriku spread out his chakra, to detect the silver-haired. A satisfied smile appeared on his face, and opened his eyes slowly as he ran through a long chain of hand seals. When he finished, he closed his eyes again, waiting for a moment, then stomped the ground with his foot. Katan, Keishi Makugahara, fire release, exploding flame crater. A crack ran through in the soil of the training ground toward a certain point where it divided in 2 running in different directions, forming a perfect circle. Toriku snapped his hands together when the two lines connected, and the earth inside the circle immediately disappeared with an explosion, filling the air with dust and the ground with soil. Toriku mumbled something and closed his eyes again, his right eye twitching continuously. "If you want to play hide and seek, Kakashi, you've chosen the wrong person," he stated when he finally opened his eyes. The young man slowly crouched down and placed his right hand onto the ground, closing his eyes and sending a massive amount of chakra into the ground below him. The soil exploded like a volcano not far away from the crater caused by his previous attack, and Kakashi burst out from the hole, followed by 5 blonde clones. Kunai clenched and shuriken flew across the clearing as the silver-haired dismissed his attackers one by one, sending a quick glance at the still crouching blonde while evading the clones. His eyes narrowed when he noted that Toriku's eyes were still closed and 2 clones appeared next to him, while the real one suddenly ran through a long chain of hand signs and placed his hands down again. His eyes never opened as the 2 clones placed their hands into his shoulders. Kakashi's eyes widened when the meaning of the hand signs reached his brain, and the Sharingan interpreted the chakra flow from the 3 blondes, but he didn't have time to move. Gekijun no Gaia, Gaia's wrath. The ground exploded around him, and found himself in the middle of a tornado. The wind swirling with insane speed, picking up leaves and small branches from the ground and mixing them in the whirlwind around him only to disappear into dust milliseconds after making connection with the razor-sharp wind chakra. Kakashi felt as a static charge reached his side from the wind wall with a chirping noise, and the sweet scent of rain and wet soil hit his sensitive nose. He snapped his hand together, running through hand signs with insane speed, blurring his movements. But before he could finish, thunder echoed inside the clearing and a thunderbolt slammed into the ground, forcing him to halt the remaining hand signs and jump backward to avoid the insanely fast attack. Another lightning strike hit his other side at the moment his feet made connection with the ground, forcing him to evade once more only to reassert his motion again less than a millisecond later, leaving no time for him to counterattack or escape from the trap. Jiraiya slowly tapped his chin and folded his arm together, watching the scene with narrowed eyes. He glanced toward Minato from the corner of his eyes, to see a similar expression on his face, which slowly turned into an amused look. "Could you do that, Jiraiya?" They turned back to the scene and slowly shook his head. Mixing together 3 elements in one attack, that is just insane. Manipulating the form, the element, mixing it together, while also separating them to utilize each one's strengths at one time. Wind to separate the victim, water as a conductor, and lightning to strike, and that is a 4th element, isn't it? Minato only nodded, fixing his eyes on the scene, not leaving it even for a moment, examining every little detail of the attack. He saw the sheer concentration on the 3 faces, the control to manipulate the elements, the shapes, and to cut down the attack to a safer level. The almost Hokage narrowed his eyes when a scene popped into his mind of a possible outcome if the team put a really massive amount of chakra into it. This attack could wipe out a smaller village at full power. Minato nodded, not surprised by Jiraiya's same thoughts. Kakashi braced himself and finally was able to finish the hand seals. The scarecrow narrowed his eyes and slammed his hands onto the ground, between 2 lightning strikes. Raitun, Jibashi, lightning style, earth flash. Electricity ran through the soil, this time in a zigzag line toward the blondes, not spreading wide as before, forcing him to jump out of the way and releasing his hands from the ground together with the jutsu, which disappeared with a last loud thunder. A massive air pressure ran through the clearing, sending dust, leaves, and debris toward the shores. Minato ran through a chain of hand signs, and smashed his palms forward with a stoic face, while Toriku mimicked his last movement without hand signs in the clearing only milliseconds after Minato. Futon, cookie, wind release, air hammer. An invisible wall of wind slammed into the approaching air pressure, countering the aftereffects of Toriku's suddenly dismissed technique, leaving the 3 people and Toriku untouched by the massive amount of disappearing elemental chakra. Toriku glanced toward the small group with a worrying look, but his head flung back when he sensed the surging Kakashi. They jumped toward him, with a kunai in his hand. Toriku narrowed his eyes at the panting boy, and a grimace spread across his face when the metallic scent of blood reached his nose while he reflected another attack with a graceful movement of his hand, like he was just sweeping down some dust from his clothes. A small stream of the ruby-red liquid ran down from Kakashi's hairline, painting it a funny pink color next to his ear. The damage was minor, not more than a deep scratch, but the razor-sharp wind chakra reached a place on his head full with capillary. Toriku jumped backward to escape from the intense taijutsu, leaving a heavily breathing Kakashi behind. Toriko suddenly stiffened when the three started whirling slowly in the crimson eyes. Suddenly the blood froze in his veins, then immediately heated up, boiling like lava, and his body started to tremble with rage. The world around him disappeared when the genjutsu encompassed his body. He immediately forced his chakra flow to stop completely, and a moment later he let the weirs down, pushing a massive amount of chakra into his coils, letting it run wildly through his body, rushing toward the caster on the clearing. The reality hit his head hard when he opened his eyes and faced a helplessly flying Kakashi in midair, who in the end finally managed to turn and land not very gracefully, staring back at him with shocked, wide eyes. Toriko slowly straightened himself. His voice lacked any hint of the accustomed warm and cheeky tone. Never, never ever use that thing on me again. Kakashi only slowly nodded with a shocked expression. Minato narrowed his eyes, observing Toriko carefully. The amount of chakra he released was even more than the time back at the hospital 5 weeks ago. The blonde turned his head to the side, glanced toward the also shocked Rin, then his blue orbs moved back, examining Toriko's every small movement. He wasn't angry, nor threatening, he was calm and imperious. His emotionless, almost foggy eyes locked for a moment with his own, then he turned and made an anxious look toward the trembling Rin. The sparkling suddenly reappeared in the blue pools and the teen slowly scratched the back of his head. Sorry, Rin, it was a little bit too much. The girl's mouth fell open and her eyes widened. Too much? Too much? She slowly shook her head and let out a sigh. Rin braced herself and forced her body to relax and send a nervous smile toward the blonde, earning an embarrassed chuckle from him, while he scratched his cheeks. He turned back to the now sitting Kakashi to send a cheeky smile toward the. So, I think the rematch is also mine. The teen only waved a dismissive gesture toward the blonde and dropped himself back on the grass. You are a monster. Toriko shrugged and smirked toward the Lang. He slowly stepped closer and offered his hand to the teen, who grabbed it and straightened himself, sweeping the dust and soil from his clothes desperately. The blonde folded his hands behind his neck and moved toward the group on the other side of the clearing with a wide smirk, followed by Kakashi, who was still trying to make his appearance less pathetic with his torn and dirty clothes. Rin stepped next to the, examining his head with narrowed eyes, then moved her hands next to his temple to heal the small wound. The silver-haired boy let out a sigh as the warm, tingling sensation numbed his brain and relaxed his weary muscles. Toriko turned toward them, his hands still at the back of his head, curiously eyeing the teen in front of him, who closed his eyes to enjoy the warm healing chakra. You tricked my nose. Kakashi slowly opened one of his eyes and a satisfied smirk spread across his face under his mask, but the expression was still recognizable. I prepared this especially for you. It was a nice move to cover your skin with a thin layer of chakra. However, not only my nose is sensitive, you know. But still, I wasn't expecting this. Kakashi only shrugged when Rin removed her hands from his head, turning to the blonde, looking for any wound, but he was untouched. Not even sweaty or weary like Kakashi. Toriko stretched his hands above his head and turned to Minato with a cheeky smile. So, now that I finished the warm-up, we can move to a more serious matter. He was grinning wild and Minato raised an eyebrow. Or you are just scared. The blonde rolled his eyes in response. Or your joints are hurting? Old man Hokage. Minato's right eye twitched and a satisfied smile appeared on Toriko's face. Bullseye. Oh, so that's it. Too old to fight. Jiraiya's face moved to a knowing smile when he saw Minato's right eye twitch again. Oh, now you've done it. So be it. Minato walked calmly into the center of the clearing and Toriko yelled in victory, punching in the air and jogged toward the blonde with a wide and satisfied grin on his face. You can't use your permanent seal. As you wish. Can we start? Toriko only nodded in response, and immediately moved his stance, while Minato, still standing casually, his hands dived into the pouch of his pants. Toriko narrowed his eyes, his muscles tensed, ready to jump. However, he hasn't got a chance to even flinch when he felt a palm slamming into the middle of his back, sending him flying toward a tree, passing beside the stoic Minato. He was able to turn in midair and land on the tree, parallel to the ground. He narrowed his eyes and rolled his shoulders to ease away the pain between them and his spine, eyeing two calmly standing Minatos in the middle of the clearing with a stoic expression on their faces, hands in their pockets. Toriko slowly crossed his fingers in front of his chest, and a cocky smile ran across his face. Tajikage Bunshin no Jutsu, Multiple Shadow Clone Technique. The clearing suddenly filled with blonde locks as hundreds of clones appeared around them, earning a loud snort from Jiraiya and an emotionless stoic look from the two blondes as they slowly turned their heads, mapping the surroundings calmly. The original Minato slowly tilted his head from side to side, letting his joints to pop, and a wide, satisfied, almost animalistic smirk appeared on his fine features, immediately erasing Toriku's cocky grin. I have a bad feeling. He couldn't even see when the two forms disappeared. His eyes and nerves couldn't transmit the information fast enough, instead his head filled with the memories of consciously disappearing clones. Their confusion, the recalls of yellow flashes behind a disappearing clone flooding into his head without a pause as the copies popped out from existence one after another with insane speed, filling the field with massive chakra smoke and making his head spin and his mind dizzy and numb by the aggressive, continuous, and confusing information flow. Not even a minute later he found himself thrown down hard to the ground. The force knocked out the wind from his lungs while his body was pinned to the soil on his stomach by strong limbs. The clone of Minato forced his hands into a painful and awkward angle toward the blue sky, grasping his wrists, while pushing his right leg painfully into his spine, forcing an unconscious and embarrassing whining sound out of his mouth as the remains of his breath left his lungs. The real Minato crouched and leaned close to his face with a still stoic expression. So, any complaints about Otuto? He could feel when his blonde locks brushed his cheeks, and the warmth of his breath on his skin. A painful gasp left his mouth as the clone forced his hands higher, and he immediately shook his head. Minato nodded in satisfaction and smirked when he released his clone and the grasp on Toriku's wrists disappeared, causing his arm to fall down limply next to his lying body. The teen slowly rolled to his back, massaging his aching hand and frowning like a wild animal at Minato. You overdid it. It was time to teach you some manners. That was only because of your idiot permanent seal. You cheated. Minato chucked and offered his hand to Toriku, who hissed when his weight pressed on his abused wrist. I wasn't using your existing mark. Toriku narrowed his eyes, watching Minato carefully. I placed a temporary one when I hit you in the back. Toriku hummed and slowly started to walk back to the group, to face a knowingly smiling Jiraiya, a satisfied Kakashi and a worried Rin, who is now eyeing his red wrists. So, lesson learned, Gaki? Toriku grimaced and pointed a finger toward Minato. Next time, I will kick your ass, Aniki. Jiraiya chuckled and turned to the teen. Every corner of this training ground was washed up with your blonde locks in less than a minute, and you already asked for a rematch? Toriku just hummed in response to Jiraiya, and he slowly got rid of his Chunin vest, examining the ink-black marking in the middle of its back with narrowed eyes. I just have to figure out how to get rid of his annoying Hiraishin. Jiraiya snorted and rolled his eyes in response, while Minato chuckled. Good luck with that. You know the title Hokage means the strongest shinobi of the village. It isn't just a fancy name, Kakashi stated calmly, and moved his 8 back over his Sharingan. How are your wrists, Toriku? Rin slowly moved closer, eyeing his hands. Nah, it's okay, it will be as good as new in an hour. See? It doesn't even hurt anymore. He slowly hovered his joints and smiled back to Rin. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow, knowing that Minato almost wrenched his wrists, but didn't make a comment. His healing abilities are really insane, thought the white-haired. I think we are finished for today. Minato stretched his arms behind his back. But before we leave, I would like you to know why Jiraiya was even here to watch your little performance. Because he will be the new sensei of the team, Toriku stated while turning to the with a knowing look. Indeed. You will be in good hands, so don't be afraid. Toriku let out a snort and waved a hand toward Minato. He felt as his face moved to a sour grimace and turned away from the sad smile of Minato. Toriku. I know and I understand, so don't say a word. He let out a sigh and turned back with an obviously false grin on his face. I'm starving. Can we pick up something to eat? The new team was dismissed from a barbecue house, leaving only Jiraiya, Minato, and Toriku left with his full stomach. The teen leaned back, contentedly stroking his full and obviously bigger stomach with closed eyes. Minato chuckled at the scene while Jiraiya eyed him with an annoyed look. Boy, I really don't want to be the one who pays for your food. Toriku opened one of his eyes and stretched his feet and arms, forming an X with his body. Maybe I had starved a lot in my previous life. The teen only shrugged and leaned back again with closed eyes. You told me that you regained a lot of your basic knowledge. However, you didn't show too much news. Minato asked and grabbed his bottle, then leaned back to find a more comfortable position. That is true, Toriku only stated calmly without opening his eyes, but as he felt the eyes on himself, he opened them and leaned on his folded arms on the table in front of him. Most of my arsenal is quite radical. I couldn't use them on Kakashi. He folded his arms on the table to rest his chin on them, facing two pairs of raised eyebrows. What do you mean by radical? Toriku let out a proud smile toward Jiraiya. I mean quite destructive. He frowned to himself. I will need to learn more lower-level techniques, or sooner or later Kakashi will kick my ass if he finds out how to deflect all of them. Have you tried Doton? Toriku nodded. Yeah, but I couldn't make any of them work properly. Minato narrowed his eyes. Still, it is incredible. I tried them yesterday with the Gekiju no Gaia's Wrath. Minato frowned. He didn't receive reports that Toriku was training yesterday. Toriku, where did you train yesterday? Home. Every training ground was full again. Minato's eyes widened to an unnatural size, almost popping out. You tried out that jutsu in your apartment? How on earth? Are you insane? You could blow up the entire house. Toriku just waved a hand and a clone appeared next to him, to hand over a scroll from Toriku's own pocket, to disappear with an annoyed look on his face. You could beat Nara in laziness, Jiraiya murmured, and Toriku only shrugged. I can't move, I'm too full. Minato slowly opened the scroll and fixed his gaze on it, together with Jiraiya for long silent minutes. A barrier seal, perfectly designed, powerful enough to resist an S-class technique and to mask its energy. No, Minato frowned. It doesn't just simply dismiss or mask the attack's chakra, it uses it to maintain and strengthen itself. Moreover, it adapts to the level of the attack to equal its force, perfectly isolating every bit of chakra and sound within the barrier. He glanced at Jiraiya next to him, and chuckled as he saw the wide eyes and the hanging mouth of his old sensei. I told you that he is better with barriers than me or you. Toriku grinned at Minato and scratched his arm. I'm satisfied with the design, however it is quite a chakra-eating bitch in this form during the first activation. I have to fix that later. The blonde teen stated calmly, eyeing the shocked Jiraiya with a satisfied smile on his face. Hey old man. Jiraiya immediately looked back at Toriku with narrowed eyes when he heard the address. You will slobber my seal, the snorted and leaned back. Impertinent shrimp. Toriku only grinned and turned toward the other blonde. Minato. When can we finally go out for a mission? Come to the Hokage Tower tomorrow. The blonde smiled back at him knowingly, while Jiraiya frowned at the statement. A satisfied smile ran across Toriku's face, and he finally forced his body to get up from the table. Great. Then tomorrow. He turned and approached the door. And Toriku the teen turned back to meet a pair of familiar azure blue eyes. If you ever try out any jutsu inside any building, or if you even think about it, I will finish what I leave off today at the training ground. Understand? The Hokage's voice was calm, but his eyes sent a cold chill down his spine, forcing him to gulp and nodded with a scared face before leaving. Jiraiya kneeled to the table and turned toward his new leader. What mission? In escort, I need someone who will guard the delegation to Suna. A half-smile formed on Jiraiya's face. Suna? What a coincidence, Minato smiled back at his old sensei knowingly. Maybe something will turn up from his past. Four figures lined up in front of the desk facing Minato, a Chunin and Sarutobi the next morning. Minato smiled at Jiraiya while he handed over the mission scroll, the details of which had been discussed the previous night after Toriku left. The envoy will wait for you at the village gates, exactly at 10 o'clock. Don't be late. Kakashi, this is mostly considering you. He only rolled his eyes, but he restrained himself from a harsh reply. Toriku, you go there incognito. Why? The teen intensively frowned at the statement. I got my reasons. You will be an ANBU during the mission. The blonde only let out an annoyed grunt, and nodded, then a second later a cheeky smile ran across his face, forcing Minato's eye to twitch. Prohibited. I didn't do anything. But you thought about it. No more ANBU teasing. Toriku frowned and a wordless fight started between the two blondes. His staring contest finally finished after half a minute, and Toriku let out a disappointed sigh and nodded, murmuring about Hokages go beyond their power, and folded his arms in front of his chest, turning slightly away from Minato. The Chunin raised an eyebrow and Sarutobi let out a small chuckle, while Jiraiya cleared his throat and nodded toward the desk before he dismissed his new team to prepare for their trip. The team gathered exactly at the announced time. Surprisingly, Kakashi also appeared on time, to meet the envoy they would escort to Sunigakure. A tall man, his body and head wrapped around with a white robe and a white half-face mask just like Kakashi's, leaving only his brown eyes open to the soft breeze. The man didn't say a word, only nodded when they arrived, and he remained silent since then. Unfortunately, the man was a civilian, which would slow down their movement by ages. The trip would be long. It would take at least 1 week to Suna, through the hot and empty desert for half of the time, then the same back. Plus the time they will spend in the city while the envoy does his job. The thoughts raced through Toriku's mind in a minute, eyeing their mysterious companion. He slowly raised his hands to scratch his forehead, but he stopped his movement when his hands met cold porcelain instead of his warm skin. He groaned in frustration and moved his hands to detach his mask, but his move was stopped when Jiraiya grasped his hands. No touching, and you aren't allowed to remove it, not even when you are sleeping. From now on your name goes by your mask. A pair of angry blue eyes snapped to his face, narrowing to thin lines, but in the end only a displeased groan was his answer from the teen in complete ANBU outfit, without the white surcoat. The teen folded his arms in front of his white vest and turned away from them without further words, who just slowly shook his head. Okay, team. We are departing. The 3 teens nodded and moved toward their companion, positioning them around the envoy. The small group finally stepped over the giant gates of Konoha and disappeared in the woods of the Land of Fire. Jiraiya eyed Toriku continuously from the background, and a small smile ran across his face when he felt a small amount of chakra slowly moving toward Kakashi's face under the mask. The silver-haired narrowed his eyes and started to scratch his face under the thin textile continuously. The blonde was obviously trying to force that mask down. An annoyed snort left Kakashi, and he gave an angry look toward the teen, and covered his face with a thin layer of his own chakra, to separate his skin and dismiss Toriku's own. You are childish. No, just curious. Toriku looked back over his shoulders toward Rin. Hey, have you seen his face? The girl only shrugged with a cheeky smile, which could mean anything, and the blonde narrowed his eyes with an irritated ch. He finally turned back and looked to his left, where he heard a faint, but fast heartbeat as they passed beside a tree. He smiled when his nose picked up the scent of a skulking fox under the bushes. He gently stroked the mask on his face, feeling the fine curves of a longish animal nose and the 3 freshly painted red curves on each side on its white surface. When he first saw the fox mask in Jiraiya's hands, and he handed over his new clothes, a real animalistic foxy grin appeared on his face, and he couldn't help on his outburst as something forced him out from the back of his mind and made him laugh until his side started to sting like hell. Before he put on the completely white mask, he felt a force, and he finally picked up one of his brushes and a red ink to finish the blank mask. He didn't know why he painted the same marks on the 2 sides of it, but when he examined it in the end, a strange satisfaction ran across his mind. He slowly stroked the painted whiskers once again and rolled his shoulders with a sigh. I'm bored to death. A clone popped up next to him and raised an eyebrow at Toriku. Are you serious about it? It's worth a try. The blonde shrugged, while everyone in the team was eyeing him curiously as the clone put his hand above Toriku's extended left palm. The 2 blondes closed their eyes in their concentration, and a small amount of slowly circulating wind appeared between their palms. The wind started to speed up and the small tornado flattened, until it was almost invisible from the side, while it formed a perfect circle from above, however not much bigger than a middle-sized shuriken. The clone started to frown, and squeezed his eyelids in concentration. Kakashi moved his hands up to uncover his Sharingan, examining the progress with the slowly swirling tones in his crimson-red orb. He saw the chakra slowly moving from Toriku's left arm, stop for a moment in his wrists, then slowly move inside his palm and sucked out by the small technique from the coils in his palm. The clone let out a small moan, as he mimicked the same process by his own body, adding his own chakra to the small technique. It reached the whirling chakra plate, mixing fire slowly, step by step into wind, causing it to glow with an unnatural orange light, just like iron in the oven before a smith started to form a sword. The movement of the wind increased once more, and Toriku narrowed his eyes. That's enough, Just hold it in that amount. The clone squeezed his teeth and a painful hiss left Toriku's mouth, when the spinning plate wobbled a bit between their palms. What are you doing? Jiraiya asked with a calm tone. I'm too occupied to chit-chat, Toriku hissed between his teeth, and with a light moan they released the technique, which slowly disappeared in the air, leaving behind a faint ozone scent in the air. The clone shook his head, while Toriku examined his red palm, and the blistering that was forming on it. We need to work more on this little thing. It needs more precise dosage than the big ones. Toriku narrowed his eyes, and made an approving nod. He let out a sigh and the clone disappeared with a puff of smoke, while he slowly dropped behind to reach Rin with an apologetic smile, who rolled her eyes. You should be more careful, you know. I'm not always beside you. She gently placed her hands above his red palm and channeled green chakra into his wound, giving a pleasant cold sensation to his burning skin. Could you teach me please, Rin-chan? Kakashi snorted and Jiraiya started to laugh loudly, earning an angry glance from Toriku. I don't think that I am the best one to teach you. You are stronger than me. Maybe, but my chakra control sucks, and I need a fine-tuning to the smaller techniques. And this is something only you could help with. Medical are the same. Without fine-tuning you just smash up everything, and I want to be lectured by the best possible. Toriku smiled behind his mask as warmly as he could, eyeing the blushing girl beside him. Please, Rin smiled and nodded, and she felt as pride swarmed up in her spine. Jiraiya smiled gently at the scene. Why do you want to even learn smaller techniques? There is a lot of powerful stuff in your arsenal, Kakashi snorted and crossed his arms behind his neck. Power sometimes lay in small forms, Kakashi-kun, Jiraiya stated casually and tapped the Jonin's head, who answered with a frustrated groan and ran his hand through his silver hair. The blonde nodded approvingly. That is true that I can be very deconstructive, but I need techniques which don't threaten the lives around me, and that is what I lack. Toriku slowly shook his head and let out a weary sigh and turned once more to Rin. Sue, will you help me, Rin-chan? Of course. Let's see. So fine-tuning she got lost in her thoughts for a minute and turned toward Toriku. You don't have problems with manipulating nature and form, and this indicates that the main problem isn't with your direct control, it lies in the amount. Let's see. Which is the less chakra needed technique you can't do properly? Bunshin Toriku spit out the word like it was sour poison. He slowly moved his hands together and performed the necessary seals, and a shapeless form appeared beside him only for it to fail the next moment and fall to the ground limply. The blonde let out an irritated sigh and the caricature of a human disappeared. See? It was totally messed up. It couldn't even stand. Kakashi frowned at the scene and turned his head curiously to Toriku and Rin. So, sensei, where should we start? Rin blushed again and sent a small smile to the boy. As a first step, you should work on that technique. Toriku nodded and moved back to his place. He closed his eyes and around 100 Toriku appeared behind the small group, walking with them, without a break in their movements. Kakashi raised an eyebrow when he curiously turned around to see the results, but he immediately frowned. What are the Kage Bunshins for? Just watch. Toriku made a cheeky smile under his mask and Kakashi turned back to the clones to see that they were forming the necessary hand seals. 100 useless normal Bunshins appeared and the small marching army behind them, frowning immediately. Toriku turned toward them and shouted. Make 4 groups, dismiss every 15 minutes. An arcane of yes, boss, echoed back to the small team and Jiraiya looked at the team with an amused expression. I see your point now. Kakashi glared at Jiraiya with a confused look, and Toriku glared back at the then only shrugged and also started to work on the technique himself. Near the end of the first 15th minute one of the clones near the group let out a victorious yelp when a man-like clone appeared next to him, wobbling on thin legs. Toriku nodded to the clone, who disappeared in an instant, and the clones made a wondering expression immediately. 5 minutes delay, until the first group disappears. The clones nodded and continued. Surprisingly this time almost every new Bunshin was able to at least stand. I don't get it. When a shadow clone dismisses, I gain back every memory. They were originally used for scouting. And with the memories I also gain what they learned. With this, I can compress years of training into weeks. But it also has got its own risks. Toriku explained to Rin carefully, earning a narrowed eye from Kakashi. What risks? Not only the memories, but also the exhaustion comes back. The teen only shrugged at Rin's worried and narrowed eyes, but the now not-so-small group walked toward their destination without a word. After the last group of clones dismissed themselves, Toriko was able to make a normal-looking bunshin if you didn't count the faceless head and his soft, orange-shaded clothes. It could make almost 5 steps before it wobbled and fell flat on the ground and dismissed itself. Toriko let out a weary sigh and shook his head slowly in his disappointment. "This is harder than I ever gave it credit for." Jiraiya moved next to him and tapped his shoulder. "Don't push yourself more today, or you will also fall flat." Toriko nodded in understanding and stretched his arms behind his head. "I know, but this annoys me to hell. Man. That is an academy-level jutsu. No marvel around that. You got too much chakra for fine-tuning. Just give up and do what you are good at." Toriko narrowed his eyes as sheer determination appeared in his visible blue orbs. "As stubborn as Minato. I just had to push the right button in his brain." Jiraiya smiled and slowly turned toward the others. "We will make camp in an hour, the sun has almost set. There will be a nice place for that after this hill." The team nodded. Their stoic and speechless companion in the middle of their group also let out a relieved sigh after the long trip. 2 hours later the camp was ready and a campfire popped cheerfully in the middle, surrounded with sleeping bags. However, only 4 were occupied as Toriko sat above them on a thick branch, in a nearby tree. He felt a familiar chakra signature approaching the tree, and the silver-haired sat down next to him without a word a second later. "You should be sleeping, Toriko-san." The blonde raised an eyebrow under his mask at the honorific, waiting for the question he already knew would come after he told the trick of the Kage Bunshin. "Could you?" Kakashi stopped, looking for the words, but Toriko finished his sentence. "Teach you the Kage Bunshin technique?" Kakashi only nodded. Toriko let out a weary sigh and ran his hands through his blonde spiky locks. "I could, but it won't be too effective to you. You don't have enough chakra to properly use it for training, however it would still be useful for scouting." Kakashi only nodded. He was already aware of that. If he learned it, he wouldn't be able to make more than a maximum of 4 or 5 clones. "But you can't use your Sharingan this time. You will learn it the hard way." Kakashi raised an eyebrow with confusion, but nodded. Kakashi had already figured out by his previous reactions, and he also caught more than one reference from Minato, that Toriko's sudden appearance was most likely connected with a Sharingan user. Toriko rolled his shoulders and pointed toward a small clearing about 20 meters from them. 5 clones appeared on the tree, standing in various directions, parallel to the ground and upside down below him. They spread around their sleeping companions while the 2 teens straightened themselves and Toriko waved toward Jiraiya, who just raised a hand in approval. When they returned after an hour, Kakashi was obviously weary, almost falling into his sleeping bag, and more than one scratch could be seen on his skin. But in the end, he managed to make a proper clone. Toriko slowly shook his head and dismissed the clones, then he moved back to his previous place on the branch. He leaned against the rough shuck of the tree and turned his head toward the ink-black sky. He always liked to watch the stars and the moon since it always calmed down his nerves and relaxed his mind. He let out a sigh as another presence sat next to him. "What now? You also want to learn something from me?" Jiraiya snorted and waved his hands. "No." Toriko nodded, but didn't avert his eyes from the soft glaze of the stars high in the sky. They didn't make a noise for a long moment. "How are you doing with your bunshins?" "Not too good, but I don't think this is why you came up here." "Why did you teach a Kenjutsu technique to Kakashi?" Toriko shrugged. "Because I want them to become strong. Maybe he can't use it for training, but it could save his life one day or Rin's. And I have confidence in him. He is already strong and someday he will become a powerful and elite shinobi. He is working very hard even if he didn't show it to the others. He always only displayed his stoic face. I knew something had been bothering him since the time he found out we were going to Suna." "How much do you know about Kakashi's background?" Toriko slowly shook his head. "Not too much. He almost never talks about himself. I know schematically what had happened in IWA, and that he is an orphan, but that is all." He glanced down to Kakashi, listening to his light breathing next to the waving fire. His father was the White Fang of Konoha, Hatake Tsukumo. A powerful, feared, and respected shinobi. His strength was on the same level as me, one of the 3 Sanins. He was assigned to a mission, and he made a hard decision. The blonde raised an eyebrow under his mask and moved his hands to his lap. He had chosen the life of his comrades instead of the success of a very important mission, which failure caused a lot of trouble for the Fire Country. After he abandoned that mission to save his comrades' lives, he was blamed for the effects, even by his own companions whose lives were saved by him. The ninja turned away from him, disgraced him, spit at him, he broke by the pressure, and he committed suicide. Toriku felt as his mouth fell open without a sound. After that, Kakashi worshipped the rules and regulations of the shinobi world. He became emotionless and worked only to wash down the shame of the Hatake name. That mission was in Suna. Jiraiya scratched his arm and yawned. However, something changed him after their teammates died. But I don't know what had happened there. Minato doesn't want to talk about that. I know what caused that, at least I think I know. Toriku let out a sigh. When we returned from Kumo, he told me something when I was down. I don't know the details, but it seems the Uchiha kid made a great impression on him, if he was able to make a 180-degree turn. Jiraiya nodded and locked his eyes on the blonde. What do you think about your own situation? Toriku blinked at the unexpected and sudden question and turned his head toward the sage, grasping his mask with a hand, waiting for his companion's reaction. Jiraiya only nodded his approval to remove the mask, and he gratefully pushed it up to his crown to rub his weary eyes. He got a ration bar from one of his pockets and started to chew it absently. He wasn't hungry, but he needed time to gather his own thoughts. He curiously, but not suspiciously, eyed his blue orbs, patiently waiting for his reply. The teen finally put down the remains of his food into his lap and leaned forward, away from the rough tree, but didn't make connection with Jiraiya's eyes. I know you are here to stop me. If I go rogue and this means you are strong, maybe I sometimes play the idiot, but I'm not stupid. I know that maybe I'm an assassin or a spy, or hell knows what I was. He let out a weary sigh and finally moved his almost glowing cerulean eyes toward Jiraiya. But I also hope and think if I am really one, if I regain my memories, I won't lose my current self. Toriku slowly shook his head and let out a long sigh, and he glanced down to the sleeping forms of his comrades. I don't want to hurt Minato, Kushina, the brats down there, or anyone else. I just want to protect those who are precious to me. He let a small smile run across his face, and he turned back at Jiraiya. And you? What are you thinking of my situation? Jiraiya chuckled and waved a hand. I got my own assumption about you, brat. Toriku rolled his eyes, patiently waiting for Jiraiya to open his mouth. I read the reports about you. And? Anything interesting? Jiraiya rolled his eyes before he answered. It told me that you got some flashbacks. The teen only shrugged. Not always, sometimes if I see something or hear something, and they aren't real pictures. Not memories. A feeling. Like a déjà vu, or something like that. When you know something has already happened to you, feel familiar, or sometimes I feel emotions. Nagato, Jiraiya stated calmly, his eyes shined with curiosity, while the teen's face mirrored confusion as he glanced back to then his eye twitched as a feeling slowly started to rise in his mind, only to be swept out in the next blink. Anything about that? Toriku narrowed his eyes, and gave a wandering face. Something popped up, but it was gone. Respect? Dunno. It was there a moment ago, but now it is gone without a trace within a blink, and I'm not sure what it was. Who is this Nagato? The teen scratched the back of his head and frowned in frustration and waited for any further explanations, but when nothing came he let out another sigh, slowly turning toward the white-haired man with a serious look. Jiraiya. What brat? Can I ask you a favor? The raised an eyebrow, but he nodded. Promise me if things go wrong and I lose myself, please don't let me harm anybody. They stayed in complete silence, watching the teen seriously, waiting for his determination to fall down, but it didn't come. His azure eyes stayed calm and solemn. I will be a quick and merciful Gaki. I promise. How generous of you. Toriku chuckled dry and sent a soft smile to Jiraiya, but he stayed serious. For minutes none of them talked, they just sat beside each other, listening to the voices of nature around them. Hey old man, go back to rest. I won't drag you along the way to Suna if you drop with fatigue. Jiraiya snorted and tried to slap his palm to the back of Toriku's head, but he leaned away from it, and chuckled softly at the playful attempt. He felt a sudden déjà vu run across his mind and a soft smile spread across his face when he looked again at the. You are really an interesting young man, Toriko-kun, and a very troublesome, cocky little brat. Toriko only chuckled, but Jiraiya finally dropped himself down to the ground and moved to occupy his sleeping bag and this time fell into deep sleep. I will relieve you in 4 hours. The teen only nodded and turned his head again toward the sky, to spot the glowing Vesper again. Chapter 10. Inside a Sandcastle. The sun was high above the horizon, sending hot beams toward the already weary team. Toriko turned around, resting his eyes on the landscape. Sand was everywhere he looked. The incessant wind carved extreme forms into the soft silky sand, building dunes and enormous mountains from the infinite supply of material. The variation of small waves and high dunes never left the horizon. Only 1 or 2 abstract cliffs raised above the golden sea, interrupting the soft curves on the horizon. Toriko turned his head to the other side, now very grateful for his mask as he saw his teammates walking against the wind with squinted eyes. He started to miss the green color of nature. They were marching for 2 days in the golden dust, but aside from a few thousand-years-old trees and some cacti here and there, he couldn't spot any vegetation. He finally spotted something in the distance. Something which was definitely not sand and definitely not the craft of nature. It was somehow too straight, too regular, but still not industrial. He narrowed his eyes and stopped walking, eyeing the thin and straight line on the horizon. Jiraiya turned toward the blonde and nodded. Those are the walls which surround Sunigekure no Sato. We are almost there. It's about time, 1 more night in this desert, and I'll go berserk. A shiver ran through the white-haired and Toriko smiled back at him in understanding. However, he really likes the nights out in the desert. As the soft sand encompassed his body from the outside, the warm inside the sleeping bag, while the outside world became cold. Somehow, for him, these extreme differences felt familiar, nice. And when he glanced up to the night sky, nothing bothered his sight during his star watch. Toriko let out a weary sigh and closed his exhausted eyes. He hadn't really slept since they stepped into the desert, and when he finally fell asleep he was wandering again in that sewer. He leaned down and slowly stroked his hands through the silky sand, enjoying as the small grains flowed out from his palm, pulled by the gravity or picked up by the always blowing wind when he lifted his hands. I know this place. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes and turned back to Toriko. Memories? The teen only shook his head and he leaned down again, gently stroking the sand, like a child playing in the sandbox. A warm smile ran across his face and he closed his eyes, enjoying once more the feeling as the sand ran across his gentle fingers. He finally let out a sigh and straightened himself to turn to his curious companion. Jiraiya in the end only nodded and waved to Toriko to catch up with the others. He slowly turned around again to glance one last time at the endless dunes, then jogged toward the small group. They reached the walls of Suna after 2 hours, and Toriko's feelings that he is in a familiar place increased continuously with each step as they closed the distance between them and the walls. There were no doors, but several guards glanced at them with a suspicious look, especially giving high heed to Jiraiya and Toriko. When they almost reached the entrance, a jumped down in front of them, holding up a hand. The small team stayed calm, but still ready to jump if necessary. Jiraiya stepped ahead and handed a small scroll to the shinobi. We are escorting a political envoy from Konoha. You can find every detail in the scroll, so if you will let us pass through the gates, we have an appointment with your Kazekage. The narrowed his eyes, as he slowly opened the scroll, readying it carefully at least 2 times, to finally nod toward 4 men who appeared next to the in a blink. He slowly wrapped up the scroll again and handed it to one of the men. Escort them to the Kazekage. They turned to Jiraiya and narrowed his eyes again at the white-haired man, who let out a frustrated groan. Don't cause any trouble. Maybe you are a powerful Jiraiya-sama, but the advantage of home is on our side. Jiraiya only rolled his eyes in annoyance, and waved a hand toward their small group. They got through the narrow passage, and when they finally reached the end, Toriko stopped his movement, and one of the Suna almost bumped into his back. Only his fast reflexes saved him from that humiliating situation. The blonde narrowed his eyes as he rotated his head from left to right, unable to place the scene. The round forms of the brown and golden houses, which looked like they were made from clay, the narrow streets, and the abstract forms warmed up his heart, and he felt his mouth curved up into a soft smile. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes again, eyeing every movement of the blonde. Maybe Minato was right and he's really from Suna. By his reaction it is more than possible, and aim is only a dead end. One of the Suna shinobi cleared his throat and Jiraiya stopped his wandering thoughts. Kitsune-san. No reaction. Kitsune-san. Kakashi, could you please? A painful and surprised yelp left Toriku's mouth under the mask as he jumped to the side, almost bumped into the same and glanced down to his side where the small amount of pain came to see the still softly sparkling finger of Kakashi. Why did you do that? It was an order. The silver-haired shrugged and nodded toward Jiraiya. I don't care. I told you I hate that shit. Geez. As if to punctuate his words, he snapped the heart at the top of his head at his last word, who gave an angry look in response while Rin let out a small chuckle. Jiraiya started to massage his throbbing forehead as the two teens started arguing and shouting at each other, completely unaware of the amused, irritated, and sniggering Suna shinobi. Jiraiya felt as a vein started to pulse with every heartbeat, and he glanced toward the two boys who were only centimeters from a real fight. Jiraiya moved closer and slapped his hand to the top of the boys' heads, freezing them in their argument. Calm down enough? Toriku glanced at the with burning blue eyes who just turned around and let out a weary sigh. When he reached their voiceless companion in white robes, the man just shook his head slowly, watching the two boys as they walked side by side like nothing had happened a minute before. The small delegation continued their trip toward the heart of the village, earning more and more glances from the villagers and the nearby shinobi, who suspiciously glanced toward their aide. They passed through several large and small passages, when Toriku slowed down his steps to stop at a passageway into a narrow alley. Toriku narrowed his eyes and turned toward one of the Suna jounins. Isn't there a ramen stand at the other side of this alley? The young shinobi gave a confused look and shook his head. No, Kitsune-san. Actually, there isn't any ramen stand in Sunagakure. The boy frowned under his mask, but only shrugged and passed carefully, watching Jiraiya. After a 10-minute walk, they were finally facing the main building of the village. The sight of the Kazgake's office warmed Toriku's heart again as he examined the round building with a lot of small windows on its side. He stepped out from the group and took the lead without any doubts of where he was going. He confidently passed by the great wooden door, earning suspicious and narrow glances from the guards at the two wings. He turned to the left, toward a winding staircase, and stepped onto the first stair, but his confidence suddenly left him. He blinked and turned around to meet with Jiraiya's raised eyebrow and two frowning Suna jonins on each side of the stairs. I think it would be better if someone else takes the lead. Toriku scratched his neck and let through a groaning shinobi, who led them to the top floor of the building and raised a hand in front of a large, carved wooden door. Stay here until you gain admission. Jiraiya nodded and moved backward together with his small team around their escorted company in white robes. They didn't leave the room for a while as long minutes slowly increased to half an hour. The Kazekage is playing with us, Toriku groaned and stared continuously after the first 10 minutes, playing with his clothes, trying everything to while away some time. Then he finally pulled out a small scroll, examining its content and earning suspicious and narrow eyes from their Suna escorts. Don't do that here, brat. Why? I'm bored. Jiraiya rolled his eyes and snapped his hand around the scroll, removing it from Toriku's hands, who let out an indignant snarl and folded his hands in front of his chest. Finally the double doors parted and they stepped out to the hallway. Admission granted. Follow me. The group slowly entered the spacious office by the lead of Jiraiya, and the envoy lined up in the background. Toriku slowly turned his head to examine his surroundings in the office. The office was plain. Beside a big desk and some chairs, it was with no frills. He spotted their invisible guards inside the room, skulking in the walls, in the shadows of a corner, outside the windows. The amount of bodyguards was annoying, so were their tensed muscles and nervous heartbeats. He shook off his annoyance, letting a soft smile cross his mouth when a familiar warm feeling increased inside him as his azure orbs met someone's back in front of the giant windows. He carefully eyed the man as he slowly grabbed his familiar triangular-shaped white and blue hat and gradually removed it, and turned around to face his visitors from the land of fire. Disappointment ran through Toriku's body when he spotted the short and spiky auburn hair and the stern expression of the fourth Kazekage of Sunagakure. He was waiting for someone else. A shiver ran through his spine when his eyes met with the Kage's narrowed ones. Is this supposed to be a demonstration of the fire's power? The Hokage of Konoha is either very brave or very foolish to send one of them to start a peace talk. Toriku felt his eyes twitch at the statement, but calmed himself. No, actually my presence here isn't connected with your politics nor concerned with Suna Kazekage-sama. The Kage narrowed his eyes as he saw the masked man turn his head toward the and shifted nervously, then seconds later avert his gaze in shame. I will give an audition to the envoy tomorrow morning. Until that time you will enjoy our hospitality near the city center. You are allowed to move in the village with surveillance. I will escort you there. The Kazekage nodded toward a shinobi, who bowed and escorted the team from the office after they politely bowed to him. The leader followed them with stern and narrowed eyes as they were leaving his office. Slowly, he turned around and walked back to the window, fixing his gaze down to the square where the Konoha shinobi appeared after a short minute. Keep an eye on them. Especially Jiraiya and the boy with the fox mask. A shadow disappeared next to the window and leapt toward the nearest rooftop, then disappeared in the shadows. Their room was also furnished austerely, and Toriko couldn't help when his thoughts wandered back to his first room back at Konoha in the heart of the interrogation and torture department. The continuous presence of guards and eyes on his back was also annoying. He let out a weary sigh and leaned flat on the hard bed. They were accommodated in the same room, without any private space. He could easily touch Kakashi on the next bed if he extended his arms. Not that sleeping below the sky was more comfortable, but they at least had space. He let out another weary sigh and turned toward the Jiraiya. The Kage said that we are allowed to go out, yes? The white-haired man nodded. You will get enough time to stroll in the village tomorrow. Please. I'm going crazy. I'll be good. The turned toward the already snoring Kakashi, then Rin, who sent a soft smile and nodded. I'll take care of him. Okay, but not for too long. And don't cause any trouble. Toriko sent a smirk toward Jiraiya and nodded. He straightened himself and grabbed Rin's wrist, almost dragging her toward the door. He slowly opened it and stuck out his head, and faced the guard in front of their room. Jonin-san, we will need an escort to the village. The shinobi nodded, snapped his hands, and two men appeared beside him. Toriko opened the door, but before they could leave the room, he heard Jiraiya shouting. If you do anything idiotic, I'm going to tell the sissy. Toriko gulped and nodded, earning suspicious glances from the joins. When they finally left the room, Kakashi opened his eyes. Why did you say that around the sun joins? To keep some extra eyes on him. Kakashi rolled his eyes and crossed his arms behind his neck to enjoy his nap again. Suna wasn't a place for sightseeing, that was obvious from the first minute they stepped through the narrow alley which separated the village set inside a wide valley from the desert and the continuously blowing wind. Walking on the almost empty streets, however, felt very pleasant for Toriko. Signs of the low economy could be seen everywhere on the streets. While Konoha's streets were full with shops, street cries, even parks, the roads of Suna were as bleak as their rooms. Most of the streets were filled with cobble, missing big chunks here and there. They passed some closed shops, their windows covered with planks nailed into the frame. Despite the difference in the welfare, Suna was the same as Konoha. Shinobi crossing the street with genin teams, civilians walking toward their own destinations, and children ran across the streets playing and shouting at each other. They finally spotted a small but nice restaurant, and Toriko almost hopped inside as his stomach gave him away, earning rolled eyes from Rin. When he finally finished the meal, which could have easily been enough to fill 3 people, he let out a satisfied groan. The small girl chuckled and handed a napkin to Toriko, who raised an eyebrow behind his mask. Your mask is full of sauce, you know. You should try eating with this thing on your face. I don't even know why he wanted me to wear this, he muttered while cleaning his mask from the sticky liquid as much as he could. I'm sure he has got a good reason for that. He never does anything without a purpose. Rin shrugged and stretched, arching her back. Rin-chan, do you think causing trouble means some training with Bunshin? Rin gave a wondering face before she answered. I don't think so, if we found a proper place for that, but no Kage Bunshins, I think. It won't be too good for us if suddenly 100 foreign ninjas popped up in Suna. Toriko nodded and grabbed the last 2 pieces of the grilled fish off his plate for later use, then straightened himself and gave a hand to Rin, who chuckled and bowed at the gallant gesture. They stepped out together and almost bumped into a woman with 2 small children. One of the boys eyed him curiously, and the other's green eyes fixed on the fishes stacked in his hands. The child slowly pulled on the woman's clothes and pointed toward the food in Toriko's hand. Can I also get one of those? The woman slowly shook her head and a sad smile ran across her face. I'm sorry, maybe next week. Toriko watched the scene as they stepped back to give the family space to pass by. Without a second thought, he slowly stepped closer and crouched in front of the children and held one piece of fish to each child. They eyed him curiously when one of them glanced up to his frozen mother and pulled her clothes once more, jolting her out of her surprise. She smiled and nodded toward the boy, who hesitantly grabbed the stick, but in the end his mouth was curved into a thankful warm smile. The smaller boy on his left also stepped forward and gratefully accepted the gift from the stranger. "Thank you, Kitsune-san." Toraku only nodded, not sure what he should say. The woman bowed and gently grabbed the children's hands and headed toward their destination. Rin stepped next to the blonde and they watched together as the cheerful children happily ate the fish, chatting and chuckling until they mixed into the crowd. "You always surprise me." The teen just shrugged, closed his eyes and let out a thin layer of chakra around him. When he found what he was looking for, he waved a hand toward a dark spot in a small alley. A frowning Sauna Kunoichi stepped out from the darkness, and she slowly approached them. "Sorry for the inconvenience, but is there a place where I can train? Nothing serious, or destructive, of course." The ninja raised an eyebrow and waved her hand to follow. 10 minutes later they reached an open space next to the village walls and sat down with crossed legs in front of each other. "Okay, show me your progress." The blonde ran through the hand seals and an abstract form of a bunshin popped up next to him. It wobbled 10 steps on its thin legs, before landing flat on the ground and popped out of existence. A snort and a loud laugh echoed in the training ground, but it immediately died down when the annoyed Toraku sent a kunai toward the laughing shinobi in the shadows. The weapon passed his head within millimeters and precociously buried up to the metal ring into the hard stone behind him, still glowing with his wind chakra. "No laughing, I'm trying to concentrate here, you know." An annoyed snort left the shadow and a man approached closer to lean onto a thick pole to observe him closer. The chakra was still too much. Rin made a wondering face, and she suddenly snapped her fingers. "Make more!" Toraku raised an eyebrow and a cheeky smile ran across his face. "How many do you want? Around 2,000? Rin rolled her eyes, but she smiled at the amused humming voice at their back. "Try first to make 10. The blonde ran through the seals again, and this time 10 clones appeared around him, wobbling a little, but this time they were standing more confidently and looked much more like the blonde in front of Rin. "Dismiss and then make 20. Toraku frowned, but he performed the exercise obediently, only to repeat one more time. In the end, 40 clones stood still in the small training ground, without wobbling, and perfectly copied the caster. Rin nodded with satisfaction and moved closer to a clone, eyeing it curiously. "Okay. Perfect. From now on, dismiss them and consecutively make one less." The blonde nodded when he finally understood the method and a smirk ran across his face. Rin moved next to the sun adjoining and sat down to eye the process from a distance. After an hour, and 30 clones less, Toraku heard the soft breathing of Rin. He glanced toward the sleeping girl and the still guarding who moved back into the shadows and let out a weary sigh. Suddenly he heard a soft chuckling from the shore of the training ground, and he felt the stiffened in the shadows and more shinobis appeared around the ground. A blonde girl stepped inside the training ground, slowly approaching the blonde. She wasn't more than maybe 4. Her green eyes curiously run over his sitting form. She walked until she stood only a meter from him. Toraku slowly tilted his head, examining his new companion, and he felt as the shinobi's muscles tensed and their heartbeats rose. He turned toward the hiding ninja behind him who received his kunai, and shook his head slowly in annoyance. "I won't eat her, you know." The girl narrowed her eyes and Toraku shook his head once again, and a sigh left his lips, muffled by his mask. The tension of his guards didn't ease down, rather it increased. "Who are you talking to?" "My babysitters." Green orbs looked onto his cerulean blue ones with a raised eyebrow. "I saw your training. You are pathetic. I can even make bunshin." Toraku raised an eyebrow, then narrowed his eyes. "I'm not pathetic. I'm actually quite strong." "You are pathetic. How could you be strong if you can't even do something which I can?" He snorted and folded his arms in front of his chest, eyeing the small child in front of him with a pout behind his mask. "Your teammates are also weak. What shinobi fell asleep in enemy territory?" "Shinobi who trust in their comrades." Toraku started coldly and narrowed his eyes on the girl. "I don't like you." The girl shrugged, but she sat down next to him, eyeing him curiously. "You are ill?" Toraku glanced down at the girl next to him with confusion. No. Then you are ugly. Toriku snorted. I'm not ugly. I'm handsome. Then why are you wearing that mask? I'm incognito. The girl narrowed her eyes, measuring him up from head to toe. I don't believe you. Only strong shinobi travel incognito. So you are pathetic and ugly. A frustrated groan left Toriku's mouth. I'm not pathetic. I'm strong. Prove it. I'm not going to prove anything to a little girl. A victorious snort left the girl's mouth, and she smirked. I know it. Toriku ruffled his hair in annoyance, and let out a frustrated groan. Fine. Look. Toriku lifted his palm, concentrated chakra into it, and a shadow clone popped out from nowhere next to him who let a satisfied smile run across his face when the girl yelped in her surprise, while the muscles of his guards tensed until the breaking point. The clone moved his hands toward his raised palm, where a small mini tornado already formed. The technique was small, but it already started to pick up sand under him, mixing it together with the wind chakra. The clone closed his eyes in his concentration, mixing another element into the swirling wind, and the increasing amount of sand mixed inside the whirling tornado. It started to glow with a bright orange color, emitting heat when the fire chakra activated. Another clone popped up on the other side, channeling another chakra element into the mix. Water started to pour inside it, steam ran out from his palms, and the flowing tornado started to slow down, until it stopped and Toriku jerked his hand under it, before it could touch his skin. A small glass statue of a tornado lay at their feet, still glowing with a faint yellow light, with a small mounting at the base. The girl leaned forward slowly, but Toriku raised her hand. Don't touch it now. The blonde moved his two palms toward the small statue, and razor-sharp wind chakra blades started to swirl around the small statue, cutting down the glass here and there at the mounting, and in the end soft wind started to flow out from his palms, cooling down the small statue slowly until he could touch it. The two clones watched it with satisfaction and finally popped out from existence with a small amount of smoke. Toriku grabbed the statue, and swept down the remaining sand from it, and handed it over to the amused child. A small souvenir. The blonde child slowly turned it, examining the still tepid glass in the last beams of the settling sun, and yelped with excitement when a beam reached its surface, fashioning at the mountain to millions of colorful sparkles. Toriku let out a satisfied smile and a weary sigh and folded his arms once more. He was very satisfied with himself and the improvement in his chakra control. How did you do that? That is a secret. The girl frowned, but he continued to look at the statue. I don't understand. If you can do that, then why did you fail before? I got a lot of chakra, and picking up this tiny amount is hard. The girl shook her head in confusion. Toriku tapped his chin and snapped his finger. He leaned forward and picked up a very small amount of sand with 2 fingers, then let it fall down to his palms. Pick only 1 grain of sand from my palm. The girl gave a confused look, but after the second try, she successfully separated 1 grain in her small palm. Toriku nodded, and now he scooped his palms into the soft sand and held them out toward the frowning child. I can't even see the grains. Toriku nodded and watched how realization appeared on her chubby face. Oh. See? That's why I can't do bunshin properly. But you did too before. Toriku slowly shook his head, ran through the seals, and a still unsteadily standing, but quite similar clone of him appeared next to him. He waved his hand toward the clone, watching and feeling as his palm ran through the compressed chakra in the air freely without any resistance. It's just an illusion, as you can see. Another Toriku appeared behind the girl and ruffled her blonde hair and sat down next to her, poking her softly with a finger, and the clone started to speak. Shadow clones are solid. Not like normal clones. This means we can hit, and fortunately we can't be hit more than only just once. That goes to the boss. The girl frowned and poked back the clone. Toriku rolled his eyes and nodded to the clone, who smirked under his mask and disappeared in a puff of smoke. Teach me that. Toriku let out a small chuckle and shook his head. No way. That is a dangerous technique, and you are just a brat. You would die if you even tried it. The small girl folded her arms in front of her small chest, sulking silently, and turned away from the Chunin. So, am I cool? The girl made a wandering face and looked up. At least she acts and looks like a normal child, not a premature kid like before. She is even cute. Torque smiled under his mask, eyeing the small child in front of him softly. Okay, maybe. But you could still be ugly under that mask. The teen narrowed his eyes and an angry snort left his mouth. I withdraw my last statement. She is a harpy. He let out a weary sigh and waved a hand to the girl. Come closer. She moved toward the boy obediently, and Torque ran his fingers fast in the soft sand, creating a fine design with every stroke of his finger into the golden soil. The girl frowned until he finished it 5 minutes later. Hey, Jonan-san, don't be scared, we will be here. The frowned in the shadows, and Torque channeled some chakra into his vast seal. His surroundings immediately became foggier and the voices around them muffled. The child shook her chubby head from side to side, and a small amount of fear ran across her face. Relax. That is just a privacy seal. We are still on the training ground, but our picture is foggy from the outside. Torque moved his hand, pushing his mask onto his blonde locks, and sent a wide foxy grin toward the girl. Satisfied? The child examined his face for a long moment, and nodded. Torque immediately put back his mask. So, this is our small secret. What do you say? The girl nodded and a warm smile ran across her face. Then I remove the barrier before my babysitter has a nervous breakdown outside. He nodded toward a foggy man, standing next to the barrier, and he channeled some chakra into it, dismissing the seal around them. He turned toward the angry and waved an apologetic hand toward the nervous ninja. You really aren't ugly. But you still look funny. Torque had leaned back on the soft sand and let out a beaten sigh and waved a hand toward the child. I'm finished with you. I don't care any more about my reputation. Think what you want. You are too troublesome. He slowly shook his head and glanced toward the slowly breathing Rin from the corner of his eyes. He sat up with a groan and tilted his head from side to side. What's your name? Temari. The blonde girl gave him a small bow, and after a shrug also mimicked the gesture. So, Temari-chan. I think it's time for me to gather my comrade and put her into a proper bed. And by the approaching footsteps, this is also the plan for you. The girl frowned and turned around to see her mother cross the corner. Torque carefully eyed as a shoulder-length, sandy brown-haired woman approached them with a worried look on her soft features and a definitely round tummy. Oh. Torque glanced down at his small companion and let out a small chuckle. You are in trouble, aren't you? The girl only nodded and waved a hand to the blonde before she ran toward the woman. Torque let out a weary sigh and turned around to gather in and move back to their room. Fortunately, the night was uneventful and peaceful. The team needed the rest, and none of them would argue with it. They were weary by the continuous walking, dry from the harsh wind, and their skin somewhere burned by the hot beams of the sun. Torque put down privacy seals on his bed, so finally he was able to get rid of his mask at least while he slept, which was only minutes after he finally laid down on his bed. The blonde shifted in his hard bed and an unconscious moan left his mouth while he was sleeping. His head jerked to the side and he suddenly stopped breathing. Jiraiya frowned at the next bed, and after half a minute without a breath, he sat up in his bed, ready to shake the teen back to reality. Before he could move to Torque, the blonde jerked up, with wide eyes, painting heavily for seconds, then he crunched his head into his lap and stayed still, waiting to catch his breath. He stayed in that pose for a long minute, while his breath settled down to a more pleasant level. He slowly leaned back on the bed, his palms rested on his eyes to ease away the remaining bits of his nightmare. The empty passages and that damn door, the sheer panic and that thing with every night that thing became stronger and stronger. This time, he could even smell its scent, but he couldn't identify any familiar part of it. It was greasy, heavy, disgusting but still somehow also inviting. I'm not going to freak out, Jiraiya. Just a nightmare. About what? The blonde shook his and let out a weary sigh. Drowning. The raised an eyebrow but didn't answer, only waited patiently for him to continue. I don't know, it comes back sometimes. The first one at Kumo, when I was knocked out. After that it comes out sometimes. The blonde let out a weary sigh and rubbed his forehead, while he eyed the blonde curiously. Sometimes bullshit. He was jerking in his dreams ever since we put our feet into the sand. Do you want to talk about it? Torque let out an irritated grunt and turned his head toward the. I didn't know you were a psychologist or good with mind. Jiraiya only chuckled quietly so as not to disturb the other's dreams and leaned back into his pillow. Sorry, but I'm tired. Jiraiya didn't answer, only eyed the teen curiously as he turned around, showing his back to him. He let out a weary sigh. He didn't need a subconscious analyst about that dream. I don't want to know what's behind that door. I don't want to open and face that thing. That is definitely not a human. Toriko glanced up, out of the window, up to the ink-black sky, spotted with faint yellow stars. He slowly closed his eyelids and forced his brain to settle down, to sink back into his well-determined dream. Hopefully very far away from narrow passageways, canals, ink-black oily water, and from that thing at the other side of the door. The negotiation was dry, boring, and they actually didn't talk about anything in particular, just hovering around each other's options without even approximating any consensus. The Kazekage was a tough nut to crack, even for Konoha's envoy when he finally spoke. The Kage concentration on the envoy only broke for moments when his eyes traveled to Toriko. That first time when their eyes met, the blonde visibly flinched by the cutting glance. After the first hour of speaking about nothing, Toriko felt his eyelids become heavier, and only a painful hunch from Jiraiya restrained him from falling asleep while he was still standing at the wall in the background. He was weary and his muscles were sore. He did sleep last night, however it wasn't reposeful. In the third hour of standing still, without any movement, he felt more weary than yesterday night, and his mind slowly became heavier and foggier. His chakra flow slowed down, and the voices in the office started to drift away and sounds muffled like he was submerged underwater. He had heard something in the back of his mind. Then he heard it one more time. A cracking voice. Someone cleared his throat. Something forced him out of his mind, and his vision slowly became clearer and clearer, to meet the stern look and the narrow dark eyes of the Kazekage. He blinked fast several times and turned his head around in confusion to realize that he was standing alone next to the wall, the remainder of his team waiting for him at the door looking at him. He scratched the back of his neck nervously and made a deep bow to the Kage, before fleeing out from the room with a hard snap on the back of his head by Jiraiya. You are unbelievable. You were able to almost fall asleep in front of the Kazekage. Toriko only shrugged and let out a weary yawn before he made one last quick glance toward the door. He still felt the leader's eyes on his back, and that forced a shiver down his spine. Toriko was sitting in the middle of yesterday's training ground alone, his mind blank as he spaced out during his training. After he dismissed his last group of 3 perfect bunshin, he felt as the weariness finally reached him, but he didn't move from his spot. He was struggling to stand up and walk back to their crowded room, but it felt nice sitting on the soft sands in spite of having his company hiding around him. He closed his eyes and slowed down his breathing, trying to lock out his tiredness, when he felt a soft tug on his clothes. He let out a sigh, but he didn't open his eyes. Hello, Temari-chan. The blonde girl made a surprised look that Toriko couldn't see, but he could still sense the increased heartbeat, her tensed muscles on her chubby face, and the sudden hic in her breathing. How do you know it's me? I can smell you, hear you, and feel your chakra signature. Those are better identifications than even your eyes. Your vision could be tricked easily, but it's much harder to trick your other senses, you know. Toriko finally opened his eyes and turned toward the small child and smiled at her amused face. For example, if you look around, you can't see anybody, can you? The child slowly shook her head and her big green eyes sparkled with curiosity. Beside us, there are 3 more people in this training ground. A guy next to that pole stinks because of the garlic he probably ate yesterday. There is a kunoichi hiding behind you underground, but her chakra flow jumped when you appeared, and the 3rd shinobi's heartbeat also increased on that tree when you arrived next to me. He slowly closed his eyes and let out a thin, almost invisible layer of chakra and nodded to himself. Temari looked around carefully where Toriko pointed, but she couldn't see anyone. You want to learn something? The face of the child almost sparkled. Her eyes begged to the blonde, and he couldn't help the warm smile that appeared on his face. I take it as a yes. The blonde chuckled softly and tapped the ground next to him, signing to the child to sit down, which was immediately done. She glanced up at him with curious eyes, waiting for him to continue. I take it you can channel chakra well if you already can do a bunshin. The small girl nodded in response, fixing her gaze on her companion. Then, channel some chakra into your nose. Temari frowned, but did as he asked. Toriko watched the process with curious eyes. A little bit more, okay, good. Now, remember this level. If it's done, you can release it. The small child nodded and turned toward Toriko with curious eyes. Now, close your eyes and sniff into the air a little. Can you smell something sweet? Temari frowned in her concentration and squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her nose to look for the scent. After 5 minutes she gave up and looked back at her temporary teacher. Nothing. Sorry. Toriko smiled beneath his mask. Now try it once more, but this time, channel the same amount of chakra into your nose. Try to push it into the flesh of your nose and not into the opening. Temari frowned, then nodded and did as he said, concentrating with every bit of nerve on the task for minutes, until her eyes popped open in her surprise. It's chocolate! A proud smile appeared on Toriko's face, and he ruffled the blonde locks of the small child next to him. He dug his hands into his left pocket and placed a small amount of the named sweet into her tiny hands. Exactly. Your reward. A wide grin spread on her face, and she immediately unwrapped the paper. They stayed in silence for several long minutes before her eyes traveled to the azure blue orbs between his mask, and the small girl frowned. You look tired. I'm tired, actually. How do you know? I could see the bags around your eyes through the holes in your mask. Toriko ruffled his hand through her hair, earning a displeased groan from his small company. You're really a smart girl. You will become an excellent shinobi. Temari smiled at him, almost grinning. You can't sleep? Toriko only nodded and glanced up to the flawless blue sky without a cloud. You are missing your home? The blonde chuckled. Home? I don't even know where I could call home. He closed his eyes and his mind traveled back to the green forests around Konoha, which warmed up his heart. Maybe I know after all. Temari gave a knowing look and she started to play with the sand in front of her, making small piles, digging holes. When I can't sleep, my mother or father tells me a story. Toriko turned his head toward the girl, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. Do you want to hear a story from me? Maybe you will be able to sleep after that. It's a story my mother used to tell me when I had a nightmare. Toriko blinked at the unexpected kindness of the girl, then nodded without a word. There once was a great shinobi, someone who was feared and honored all over the lands. He was the nephew of the lightning god, you know. He traveled all over the world, teaching all kinds of techniques to anyone who wanted to. But he actually traveled to hunt down the monsters of the world and bring peace to the lands by defeating every demon. He fell asleep one day under an oak tree, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a fox looking for food in his bags. He watched the fox and in the end, he offered his last piece of dried meat. Years after that, when he faced a demon near a village and he was about to die from his wounds, a fox appeared and sat down on his stomach to protect him from the demon. The fox couldn't help the shinobi, but he gave a final gift to the man and placed him into the sky. If you look up at the night sky, you can see him in the stars watching over us and fighting with the monsters of the night, which don't let us sleep. This is how in the end he brings peace to the world in our dreams. Toriko stayed in silence for several minutes, eyeing the young child carefully. This isn't a bedtime story, I think, but it's still nice. Temari shook her head. No, but I like it. My mommy tells it much better. Father once showed me where he is. He called him Orion, I think. Toriko blinked and looked up to the blue sky, where he knew the constellation would appear in a few hours. Thank you, Temari-chan. I think I will be able to sleep tonight. The child smiled at him and felt as his inside melted away, but he didn't dare to even move a finger. The child chuckled and turned back to her almost ready sandcastle. Toriko smiled at the pleasant scene and he couldn't avert his gaze from the happy face. He suddenly froze as he felt a familiar presence at a nearby house. He slowly turned his head to the side and looked up at a balcony to meet two dark and stern orbs. The eyes didn't avert from him when the man slowly approached them, floating in the sky on a golden cloud, to land gracefully on the sand in the center of the training ground. The Kazekage stood behind them, his arms folded in front of his chest, and his gaze sent a cold chill down his spine as the power of the man crested above his sitting form. The child didn't notice his presence as she continued creating another tower for her sandcastle. Toriko finally braced himself and straightened, attracting Temari's attention as he bowed to the leader. A soft yelp left Temari's small mouth and the dark eyes of the Kage traveled toward the child. Temari. We agreed on something last night. The voice of the Kazekage wasn't even similar to what Toriko already heard. It was hard, somehow still soft, and the child looked down to the sand in front of her in shame. I'm sorry, father. The child nervously closed her small fingers around the edges of her clothes. Go home. We aren't finished. The girl had bowed lightly and fled from the ground as fast as she could, but in the end, she still waved a hand toward Toraku. The blonde didn't even dare to blink, as the Kage moved his eyes back to his blue orbs, watching him suspiciously. I'm very interested why a shinobi of Konoha would teach anything to a child of Suna. Especially to the Kazekage's daughter. Toraku blinked in confusion and bowed once more, forcing his muscles to move despite the enormous killing intent flowing continuously from the Kage. He felt as two of the shinobi nearby started to shake by the feeling. The cold and threatening tone of the man sent chills again down his spine. I didn't know Temari-san was your child. I apologize, Kazekage-sama, if I caused trouble or my actions made you worry. I haven't got any malicious pretense toward your child nor to your village. He narrowed his eyes. He himself didn't know why he did that. Before his awkward silence could treat the Kage's tense nerves, he felt a familiar chakra signature and relief flow across him. He never ever was so glad for the presence of the man slowly approached them, seeming to be aware of the situation. Kazekage-sama. He bowed to the Kage, who narrowed his eyes as a response. I demand explanations about your attendance in Sunagakure and his purpose. Immediately. They turned to Toraku and raised an eyebrow at the teen. What did you do? Toraku raised a hand behind his head and scratched his neck nervously. I just immediately removed the mask. I won't tolerate unknown and seemingly powerful shinobi around my children. The let out a sigh and shook his head in defeat. Kazekage-sama, allow me a short discussion with my Hokage. I didn't receive authority to reveal his identity. The Kage narrowed his eyes and nodded. The bit down his fingertip and ran through a chain of hand signs. Toraku immediately recognized the jutsu, and when a small yellow toad appeared in a puff of smoke, he felt his mouth curved up in a soft smile behind his mask. The small toad looked around and stiffened when he felt the Kage's angry gaze on him, and immediately turned to Jiraiya. Tell Minato that the Kazekage demands to see under the fox's mask. It's urgent, no wandering around, okay? The toad rolled his eyes and disappeared in a puff of smoke without a word. The Kage stayed still with folded arms, eyeing Toraku with narrowed eyes, until within a small puff of smoke the yellow toad appeared on the shoulder of Jiraiya again in 5 minutes. Hokage-sama agreed until it is necessary, but only within 6 eyes. Jiraiya nodded in response, and the small toad immediately disappeared with a small puff. Kazekage-sama, if you agree, would we please be able to continue this in a more private place? The leader nodded and turned around to head back inside his office. When they reached the building, the Kage snapped a finger and Toraku felt as if every guard disappeared from the room, however not very pleased to leave their leader alone with 2 enemy shinobi. Especially not with one of the. Jiraiya showed a privacy seal to the Kage, who nodded his agreement, and the blonde felt the same way like yesterday on the training ground. Lower your mask, Toraku. Jiraiya stated calmly, and the teen obediently took down his mask after a moment of hesitation. The Kazekage eyed him from head to toe, without showing any emotions, only his right eye twitched almost invisibly at the sight of the young man. Who are you? The blonde blinked and bowed. Odoroki Toraku, Kazekage-sama. What is your purpose here? Toraku gave back a confused look and turned toward Jiraiya. To escort Konoha's envoy. The Kage narrowed his eyes and moved his orbs toward Jiraiya. Understanding flashed through his dark eyes when he connected the dots in the small puzzle, but his face stayed calm. I see. Then we should still clear one more question. Why are you wandering around my daughter? Toraku blinked and answered hesitantly. Actually, it wasn't me who was wandering around her. She was the one who found me twice and didn't leave. Why did you teach my daughter? Toraku only shrugged. Because she asked? The Kage narrowed his eyes, and confusion ran across his mind, however it wasn't visible on his face. He widened his senses at the very moment they stepped inside the office, to sense every twitch in his chakra flow, every tense in his muscles, even the changes in his smell, but the boy stayed calm and honest. What the hell? The leader narrowed his eyes, his cold glazed almost stabbing through the azure blue orbs of Toraku. The 3 men stayed in complete silence for a long minute, waiting for each other's reaction. The Kazekage finally turned around and he slowly stepped to the large window. You can put back the mask. Leave. I want to ask Jiraiya-san to stay for a little longer. And from now on, avoid my daughter. His voice was calm and tempered. Toraku put back his mask and he left the room after a bow without a word. The Kage let his eyes dwell on the village below his feet, and finally turned around to face the, who stood motionless in the middle of the room. Your Hokage is a fool. Do you think I will tolerate that he sent a shinobi here, who needs surveillance of you? You brought possible danger to my village without my knowledge. To start a peace talk. Jiraiya's face stayed completely calm, and his tone made the same impression. My apologies, Kazekage-sama, but I don't think Konoha's home affairs are considering you in any aspects. He put his foot inside the land of wind, inside my village. At this moment, it isn't a home affair. He is a threat to my people. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes and stepped next to the Kazekage and glanced out of the window, to catch as Toriku turned at a corner, heading back to their room. I know you made strict security preparations because of our arrival. Especially for me, and Toriku-kun. Tell me, what did your shinobi see when they watched the boy? What were their reports about? Because I don't think they were about a possible threat. The dark eyes of the Kazekage visibly twitched. He is someone like you and I were once, before we lost ourselves in the shinobi world. He still carries and gives goodwill to anybody without considering who he gave it to. Goodwill isn't the value of a shinobi. No. That is true. It is the value of a person. Jiraiya slowly turned around to face the Kazekage, whose expression stayed the same, only his eyes mirrored some foggy emotions. Jiraiya bowed and left the room without a word, leaving the Kage alone with his thoughts. A young blonde girl was sitting on the windowsill, looking up to the darkening sky. She had already spotted the Vesper, and was waiting patiently for more stars to appear. She wasn't aware of a man, leaned onto the doorframe of her room, watching her carefully without a word for a half an hour now. Temari. The girl flinched at the sudden voice and looked back at her father. Yes, father? The small child glanced up toward the darkening sky, desperately looking for something, and she felt as her father moved closer to her small form, and also sat down on the stool next to her. What are you doing in the widow? I'm waiting for the stars. The Kazekage frowned and glanced up to the sky. You can't sleep? The girl shook her head slowly. I wanted to stay awake until he could sleep. Who? Kitsune-san. The leader narrowed his eyes and leaned closer to his child, watching her carefully. He spotted a small statue in her small arms. Don't go near him. The girl turned toward her father with confused eyes. Why not? Because he is an enemy ninja from another village. The child frowned in her confusion. I don't think he is a bad man. He looks funny, but he isn't mean. The Kage frowned. You saw his face? The girl nodded slowly, not sure whether she should have told this to her father. He told me that I can't talk about what he looks like, because he is incognito. The man frowned in his bewilderment. Why on earth would an enemy ninja show his face to a child? You asked him to show it? Temari gave a wandering look, tapping her small chin, then shook her head. No, I just told him that I think he is ugly under his mask and that's why he wore it. The Kage rested his dark eyes on his daughter's chubby face, wondering what this could all mean. Temari, why do you want to wait for the stars? Because he didn't tell me why, but I know he can't sleep well. So I told him the tale you used to tell me when I couldn't sleep, about Orion. Why did you tell him that? Because he helped me, and I thought it might help him. The Kazekage's expression softened as he eyed his daughter. You really want to wait because of that? It will be more than an hour until they appear. The girl only nodded, and turned toward his father with determined eyes. A soft smile ran across his face as their eyes met. Strange. Temari wasn't that kind of girl who cares too much for others. Actually, she didn't even like her brother. They were always fighting, arguing, but somehow in the last 2 days it suddenly stopped. The Kage opened his arms and moved her daughter into his lap. I'll stay until you go to bed, okay? Temari smiled back at him and nodded, then she tumbled herself into the soft fabric of her father's clothes, averting her green orbs to the darkening sky, looking for Orion together with the leader of Sunigakure. A blond man was lying in his bed, glancing outside the window of their small, crowded room. It had been an hour since the first star appeared in the ink-black sky, but he was still waiting for a group of stars to finally appear in the left corner of the window. He was waiting for Orion, in the hope to finally sink into a dream without the endless sewer. When the stars finally appeared in the sky, a soft smile spread across his face, and he let out a weary breath, and sank into a dreamless night. The Kazekage rested his eyes on Toriko for several moments when they entered the small office, but he didn't show any emotion, neither on his face nor in his eyes. In the end, the preparation for the final peace talk with the Hokage himself was successful. However, the Kazekage made bold claims in case of a future alliance, unlike Konoha's more moderate requests. The team carefully watched from the corner of his eyes. They didn't talk after he left the Kazekage's office yesterday. However, he was prepared for a rocket. Maybe he was bequeathing it to Minato. He unconsciously gulped when he remembered the threatening cold blue eyes of Minato the day before they left for Suna, and it forced a shiver down his spine. When the envoy finally finished and bowed toward the Kazekage, a loose sigh left Toriko's mouth. It's over. They would head home in minutes. He closed his eyes and a small homesickness ran through his veins when he thought back to Konoha. Their team also bowed to the leader, while Jiraiya thanked their accommodation and hospitality before they left the room, followed by the dark eyes of the Kazekage. The small team left Sunageki right after the last glance from the Kage of the Sand Village. The travel from Suna was so uneventful that it was a pain in the ass. Toriko let out a relieved sigh when he finally spotted the great walls of the village with the two enormous wooden wings. He cheerfully hopped inside the village, and sniffed into the air to finally feel the familiar, sweet scent of Konoha, the mixture of wet soil and the freshly cut grass. Jiraiya tapped his shoulder and sent a smile to the blonde and nodded with his head toward the Hokage Tower. The soft smile under his mask immediately melted away. He gulped, anticipating his execution by the blonde village leader. However, he still didn't quite understand what he did that was so damn wrong back in Suna. He could only think of the daughter of the Kazekage, and that only happened because he didn't know who she was. He let out a moan, but finally he nodded to the. They slowly approached the tower, and Toriko hesitated at the door of the office before he stepped inside to face his destiny. Minato held his head in one of his palms as he frowned at a large scroll rolled over the desk. He blinked and finally turned his head toward the small group, a soft smile on his face. It took you long to finally arrive. I expected you earlier. Jiraiya only shrugged and handed over his report about the mission, which he'd already carefully prepared last night. The envoy also handed over his own scroll, bowed to the Hokage, and then left the room without a word or even a nod toward the 4 shinobi who he'd lived with for more than 2 weeks. Minato rolled his eyes at the scene and waved toward Toriko. You can get rid of the mask from now on. Toriko blinked in confusion. He had forgotten that he was even wearing it. He was so used to doing everything with that thing on his face. He hissed in his annoyance and a muffled curse left his mouth, but he happily lowered it from his face. That is much better. Thanks. Minato smiled gently and held his hand toward Toriko, who placed it into his brother's open palm. It's a shame. I had plans with that. Kakashi, I got some news for you. Minato made a cocky smile which forced the Jonin's only visible eyes to twitch, and in the end he raised a curious eyebrow. The beast is back and already looking for you. A defeated groan left the Jonin's mouth and palmed his forehead in irritation. When will he leave? Next week, so you will have some time together. The let out a weary sigh and nodded. Toriko's eyes were fixed on the Kakashi, wide with curiosity. Team meeting at my apartment at 6. What do you think about that? The Hokage asked cheerfully, and received nods and willing sounds from every member of the team. Before they turned around to leave the room, Minato hollered out, Toriko, Jiraiya, a moment please. A soft moan left the blonde's mouth, but he turned around and closed the door behind the. I really didn't do anything. I swear. Minato gave a confused look to the blonde and to Jiraiya, who only shrugged, but nodded. He really didn't do anything. Minato sent an apologetic look toward the blonde and smiled. Actually, I wanted to thank you. You made quite a big impression on the Kazekage, and that was also my intention besides some additional reasons. Toriko gave a confused look, and a raised eyebrow, then in the end he folded his arms in front of his chest, waiting for some explanation. Because of Kitsun's pressure, he wasn't playing poker during the preparations. The 4th Kazekage is a hard nut to crack if we are talking about diplomacy. He has got quite a unique view of the ninja world. And I also counted that in the end when you had to remove your mask. You used me as a distraction? Minato made another apologetic smile and shrugged, while the teen's eyes narrowed to a dangerous level. Sorry, but if I told you about my plan, you wouldn't play your role. You are an awful actor, Toriku. The named teen turned to Jiraiya, emitting a proper amount of killing intent toward the. You knew about this the whole time, didn't you? And you left me in the thought that I ruined something after I had to remove my mask. For a full week while we traveled home. Jiraiya smirked and shrugged cheekily. If you may pardon me, I think I have to leave now, or I will try out one of my on the pervert in your new office, Minato. The blonde chuckled and waved a hand, and the blonde left the room across the window without a word, with a twitching eye, but a still forced stoic face. However, Minato was sure, if he found a report tomorrow about a wiped-out training ground, he would know who to blame. Minato let out a sigh and turned toward his sensei. So? Anything interesting news not included in your report? I had contact with every last one of my spies, instructing them to watch out for someone with a Sharingan, but until now nothing. Jiraiya frowned and moved his thoughts toward Toriku. He definitely had been in Suna before, even in the Kazekage's tower. At some part he led the way, then he suddenly stopped and became confused. However, the Kage didn't recognize him. Actually, he almost killed him when he found out his daughter was befriending him. Maybe he was somehow connected with the third one. Jiraiya shrugged and continued. Since the night we stepped inside the desert, he has had nightmares. Drowning. At least he had said it was about that, and he seemed quite honest and disturbed enough when we spoke about it. But they suddenly stopped the night when he removed the mask. However, I don't think it was connected with that event. So we still can't completely rule out Suna. Minato sighed and massaged his forehead. Jiraiya moved closer and sat down on the chair. I also travel a lot. I had already visited every big shinobi village, and I didn't leave all of them with pleasant memories. We could assume that Suna was an important place for him. I told him Nagato's name. He reacted, however he said he wasn't sure what he felt, but he told me that it was respect. Everything still points much more toward aim than Suna. Sannin shrugged, then he narrowed his eyes and fixed his gaze on the desk. I think you can relax. He won't do anything to harm you or the village. He will be okay under the continuous checkups with the Yamanaka. Jiraiya frowned and didn't continue his report for a minute, while Minato narrowed his eyes, carefully observing his sensei's uneasy expression. He asked me a favor. Minato raised an eyebrow and watched his sensei curiously, waiting for him to finally reveal something while he was definitely fighting with himself in his brain. He asked me to kill him if something goes wrong. Minato's eyes widened with shock. He froze for a long minute while thoughts ran through his brain. Jiraiya slowly shook his head, to ease away the disturbing thoughts. You gained a really honorable relative, Minato. The Hokage let out a sigh and dug his face into his palms, but a small smile still forced itself out. I know. Kushina made a feast for the gods, and Torika thankfully inhaled every last bit of the food after living mostly on ration bars for 2 weeks. The kunoichi watched him in awe as a third bowl of rice disappeared in his almost endless stomach. Who is this beast? Toriku asked curiously, leaning toward Kakashi, who just let out a sigh while Minato laughed until it finally died down to chuckles. The green beast of Konoha, the eternal rival of Kakashi-kun. The snorted and folded his arms around his chest. You will know him in time, I'm sure. He is a very unique shinobi. Minato started with a wondering face, looking up to the ceiling, tapping his chin until a cocky smile spread across his fine features, earning a confused look from the blonde. Torika glanced toward the annoyed Kakashi, but in the end only shrugged and continued inhaling his food. The team meeting didn't last long. They chatted about Suna, the desert, the town, and in the end the obviously low economics of the village. Then Toriku proudly stated that he mastered Bunshin, earning a confused look from Minato and Kushina. You know, I asked Rin to help me with my chakra control. Before that I wasn't able to make a proper one. I don't think I could have done it without her. The young girl blushed, but she looked back to her first student with obvious pride. Minato shared a look with Jiraiya and turned to Toriku. I want you to play with open cards from now on. Show us the techniques you mentioned before you left for Suna. A cheeky smile ran across Toriku's face. Okay, but find a place where disappearance won't bother you. Minato raised an eyebrow, but nodded and noted the skeptical faces on the others. Only Kakashi held his always stoic expression. Then tomorrow after the team meeting. The young teen nodded, but his cocky smile never left his face. The team left the small apartment, and Toriko volunteered to see Rin home, and Kakashi also tagged along. They slowly walked toward the narrow streets of Konoha, passing several civilians and shinobi. Toriko glanced up to the sky and crossed his arms behind his neck as they approached Rin's apartment. An irritated groan left Kakashi's mouth, and Toriko tracked his eyesight toward a round mess of black hair and 2 huge eyebrows in green spandex. A snort left his mouth as he realized he was facing the green beast of Konoha. The shinobi jumped in front of them gracefully, and the blonde had to admit that, despite his appearance, his every movement exuded confidence and power. A wide grin appeared on his face, and he burst out into Kakashi. "Hello everyone. I haven't seen you for weeks, Kakashi. I had almost lost my youthful thoughts without my eternal rival." Kakashi folded his arms and tilted his head to the side. "I was out of town for a mission." The beast nodded and turned toward Toriko. "And who is this youthful shinobi? Isn't he your new teammate everybody is talking about?" Toriko raised an eyebrow and glanced toward the chuckling Rin, who waved a hand to him, while Kakashi nodded. "Yash! I am Mado Guy, the beautiful and youthful green beast of Konoha." The boy grabbed Toriko's hand and started to shake enthusiastically, and Toriko felt as his mouth fell open in his shock. "Odoroki Toriko. Nice to meet you." He finally graced himself and closed his mouth, glancing toward Kakashi from the corner of his eyes in disbelief. "Kakashi and this guy together? My rival, when will we encounter our youthfulness again?" Kakashi massaged his forehead and shook his head. "Guy, we've just got back from a mission. I will look for you, okay?" The green beast grinned toward and nodded, then disappeared after he waved goodbye to the others with the sunshine. Kakashi let out a relieved sigh and turned to the chuckling Toriko. "Well, Minato was right. He is really a unique shinobi." Toriko couldn't help it, and he burst out laughing and tapped the shoulder of the while they continued their trip toward Rin's apartment. The Yondaime Hokage of Konohagaku no Sato felt as his knees started trembling, and he forced his muscles to move as he sat down onto the soft grass next to Kushina, whose lips parted, almost reaching the ground under her. The blue orbs mirrored shock and disbelief. Jiraiya watched the scene in front of his eyes, leaning against a giant rock, blinking rapidly, next to his other 2 new students in complete awe. And this is what is called Yuzu no Naraku, Whirlwind of Hell. 2 clones popped into existence, holding out their hands, and a great tornado appeared from Toriko's palms, mixing with fire chakra and glowing a blindingly bright orange color. As the wind chakra reacted with the fire, its heat increased to an unbearable level. Toriko released the technique into the air without hitting anything, being sure to avoid a possible forest fire. He forced his breath to settle down and wiped the sweat on his forehead with the back of his hand. He showed everything that was in his mind from his arsenal. He made a satisfied grin when he looked over the faces on the side of the clearing, and his heart twitched when he met the awe and pride in Minato's blue orbs. "I worked on a smaller form of this during our trip to Suna, but I didn't try it out since I trained with my bunshins, so there is a chance it won't work." Toriko extended his left palm, and a clone hovered his own palms above the overtop, just like 3 weeks before on their trip. The small tornado immediately appeared and started to become thinner until it reached a thickness of a razor blade, while the clone started to channel his fire chakra into it slowly. This time, it didn't wobble when it finally started to glow in bright orange, and Toriko nodded to himself in satisfaction. "I don't think I could throw it. At least not now," he muttered and frowned. "But I could still use it as a blade, or something like that until I figure out how I can do that." "You made this in 2 weeks? You have developed a new technique?" Minato blinked in disbelief, and Toriko released it and scratched one of his whiskers, thinking. "Well, not exactly. I tried it only 5 or 6 times. However, I didn't try it out with other elements. Maybe it could also work with water and lighting." A wondering expression appeared on his features and nodded to the clone, who just shrugged and repeated the movement before. Toriko concentrated water chakra into his palms and forced it into a thin line while it circulated in his hands. The clone started to channel the lighting element into it slowly, when the form suddenly started to wobble and a muffled shit left the teen's mouth. When the technique collapsed in his palms, it sent lightning chakra through his body, and the clone puffed out from existence with a yelp. It knocked him hard to the ground, forcing out the wind from his lungs as his muscles in his chest squeezed painfully, his limbs jerking unstoppably, and his eyelids and teeth squeezed together from the force. When the element finally left his body, his persisting jerking died down to almost continuous small twitching. He forced his eyes open and rolled his body onto his stomach. He distantly noted that the others were next to him, and someone was already touching his back, probably Rin, but their voices were muffled and he couldn't use his eyes. When he tried to focus, only perpetually dancing white spots appeared in front of the foggy picture of the green grass he was lying in. He slowly moved his arms below his chest to push himself up, but his joints gave up, and he landed hard against the soil when his joints folded after another twitch. A harsh moan left his mouth as he was finally able to focus his vision to a blade of grass centimeters from his eyes. He finally wobbled himself to his hands and knees and shook his head to clear his foggy vision and brain. However, that was a bad idea. He immediately leaned forward and clapped his hands onto his mouth, forcing back the feeling to let out his breakfast in front of everyone. He breathed hard through his nose, his eyes closed into a thin line, and he tried to focus his brain on something else. Anything other than the feeling in his stomach. Finally it left him and he was finally able to push himself up to sit properly, leaning on his hands, his legs stretched out. I still hate lightning releases. He cursed under his breath with a muffled and harsh voice, blinked, and the picture of a worried Rin suddenly appeared in front of him, together with some dancing white spots. He shook his head again and blinked, forcing the annoying white spots to finally die down. I'm okay now. He forced a smile on his face to meet one of Rin's raised eyebrows and the disbelief on her soft face. A bright crimson tuft of silky hair dropped onto his shoulders and he realized that it was from Kushina, who lightly leaned above his head, grinning like a maniac, and patted the crown of his head before she moved back to give him more space. He felt a gentle touch on his shoulder, and when he turned to the other side, he found the couching Minato next to him, observing him with concern. I'm really okay. Jiraiya also stepped closer. His laugh filled the scarred lands around them while he ruffled the golden locks of Toriku. You know, sometimes I think you two are twins. Minato looked exactly the same when he showed me the first version of his Hiraishin. He even threw up. It was a nasty scene. The named Hokage mumbled something incoherent under his breath in response while rolling his eyes in irritation, but his reddening cheeks were evidence of his embarrassment. Minato straightened himself and looked around on the devastated training ground. A great crack ran through the middle where one of the S-class wind releases met with the soil. He moved his eyes toward a giant black crater, which was made by a Katon, Goryoka no Jutsu, Great Dragon Fire technique. Then he rested his eyes on the several cracks, cuts, craters and charred part of the training ground. The destruction was overwhelming, however Toriku carefully reduced the efficiency of the techniques. He leaned down to the team and lifted him by his arm, gaining a thankful look from his brother. I think that was enough for today. The blonde only nodded as he leaned on his still unsteady legs. I'm finished. I showed you everything that I've got and I'm out of chakra. Minato nodded and a soft, warm smile ran across his face. Out of chakra? He's still got more left than an average genin. I'm proud of you. Toriku blinked and he couldn't hide the smile on his face or his slightly red cheeks. Thanks. Minato ruffled the blonde locks and let the still smiling blonde put an arm around his shoulder to help support his weight on his wobbling legs, while they walked back to the village for his well-deserved rest. Chapter 11. Legacy. The days and weeks went by with insane speed since they had returned from Suna. The peace talks with the other nations were going better than anyone would have expected. The fights and battles settled down at the borders, and the incidents between the nations had been limited to politics and battles of words inside offices and meeting rooms. Toriku let out a weary sigh when he thought back to why he was even sitting here for hours. Despite the national conflicts outside calming down, his inner struggle only became stronger and stronger. He was drowning again in his dream, however the door still held out, despite the increasing number of cracks and salients on its rusty surface. That dream avoided him for a while after they returned from Suna, but in the last week it appeared again with a force never before. Toriku glanced over the sleeping village under his feet from the top of Minato's newly carved head on the Hokage monument. It was almost 3 months since he had actually gotten into the everyday life of Konoha, a little bit more than 2 months since he became a shinobi of the village. They had taken several missions, mostly similar to his first, transferring reports and supplies to the borders and to other guard posts all over Fire Country. But some missions which were not connected to the war were starting to appear, and sometimes he helped in tracking with other teams, however they were rare occasions. A satisfied smile ran across his face as the first beams of the sun reached the top of his head, and slowly, almost invisibly moved down on his sitting frame, warming up his body. The village gently started to wake up. He already could smell the sweet scent of the fresh bakery products. An ANBU squad leaped from rooftop to rooftop, in the direction of the village gates, probably already leaving for a mission. They're leaving pretty early, Kachan. A silhouette of a kunoichi stepped out from the shadows of one of the yondame's spikes and sat down next to the smiling young chunin. He already knew most of the ANBU who were still assigned to watch over him, and he gave up the continuous pranking on them. Well, mostly. The devil never sleeps, and there was no way he would miss a perfect opportunity just screaming for his awesomeness. He still wasn't completely used to the feeling of continually being followed, but he came to terms with it, and also with the weekly checkups with the Noichi. They also started to meet on the weekends, forming something that could not yet be called friendship. He knew that it was for everyone's safety, and he couldn't deny that sometimes he was thankful to Sarutobi, regardless of his annoyance, that he didn't let down the surveillance despite Minato's request. In the end, Minato didn't go against his sensei's last will as the third Hokage, however he would be able to. He was the new Hokage after all. But Toriku knew that his brother respected the old man enough not to do that, and he didn't complain anymore. How long will you stay here, Toriku-kun? The teen only shrugged, not looking back to his masked companion. Dunno. I like to wait until the streets start to become crowded. He let out a satisfied moan as he stretched his arms behind his back and leaned on them. I saw you yesterday in the jewelry store. The ANBU flung her head to the side and narrowed her purple eyes under the mask. Relax. I only saw your back. But I recognized your scent. You shouldn't wear that robe, you got a nice butt. A furious snort left the girl as she immediately got up and moved back to the shadows, cursing and muttering under her mask. That was a compliment, you know. He looked over his shoulder where the kunoichi stood in the shadows, then shrugged when he received no answer. Girls, nothing good enough for them. He let out a sigh and continued watching the rising village under his feet. The team lined up in front of a long desk, waiting for their next mission. Minato let out a weary yawn and scratched his burning eyes to ease away the unpleasant sensation. Then he glanced toward another desk in the corner of the room, where an also obviously tired and weary-looking blonde clone frowned, leaning onto his hands above a big pile of paper. The clone blinked and made a grimace above a request and lifted up a signet to make a red marking of disapproval, muttering something angrily about unnecessary tawdry desires. Minato nodded toward the clone, who waved his hand in irritation as an answer and pulled out another document from the pile to this time snort in his disapproval. Minato sent a thankful glance toward his brother, who suggested the idea yesterday night to use a clone to catch up with himself, when Minato almost collapsed on the futon when he finally arrived home. Peace talks go hand in hand with enormous amounts of bureaucracy, and somehow Hiruzen had forgotten to mention that when he offered his seat. He would gladly delay his nomination by half a year if he'd known that in advance. Jiraiya cleared his throat, and this slapped Minato out from his wandering thoughts. He also cleared his throat and leaned toward a big pile of mission scrolls, handing over the correct one to his once-sensei. This time you will go to the Kusa borders to relieve a sedentary force at one of our posts. It will be a week until the next relay, so prepare equipment for that period. Jiraiya raised an eyebrow, but in the end only nodded, and they left the room after a short bow and a waving hand from Toriku. His two teammates were tense as they started approaching their destination, where they'd lost their teammate and friend. Toriku was unwontedly silent when he felt their mood, and he moved closer to the sage to chat with him during their trip. They befriended him last month, and he was slowly proving that he really liked Jiraiya. Well, except when he was annoying and showing off around girls. But despite that, he started to build up respect for the Toad Sannin, and he was thankful for the way the man acted around him since the first time they had met. Not with immediate suspicion in his eyes like the others, he was more natural, especially since Suna. Maybe in some ways he trusted Jiraiya more than anyone else in the village, including his brother, despite their growing acquaintance since Minato's official nomination. After the public ceremony, people started to recognize him, greet him, and he really enjoyed the sight of the smiling and beckoning villagers and shinobi. They didn't announce their relation, however everybody who wasn't blind or half-idiot could realize they were relatives by their appearance, how they interacted with each other, and the amount of time they were spending together. Gossip started to rise in the streets of Konoha and in the shinobi ranks about their relationship and his sudden appearance, and such talk increased with every rare instance he joined another group with Jiraiya or someone saw him training or sparring. Especially with Minato. A proud smile ran across his face as he thought back to their last spar, even though it ended with an almost perfectly cleared training ground and unfortunately many more bruises on him than he would call acceptable. He could mostly keep up with Minato, until he used his annoying Hiraishin. Toriku had already spent long and sleepless nights trying to figure out how he could counter his irritating seal, but he failed. But he was certain that the solution was near. Well, almost certain. Toriku thought back to the public ceremony when Sarutobi handed over his hat, and Minato first put it onto his own head. Minato's eyes almost glowed by the emotions, the joy, the pride, and the overwhelming determination which shined in his blue pulse. He also felt the same pride when he was silently standing in the background together with Jiraiya, Kushina, Rin and Kakashi, but he was also aware of the disturbingly great amount of envy which ran across him for a second. An unconscious grimace appeared on his face, but it was replaced by a smile when he remembered the small, green and obviously old toad that appeared after the ceremony. He thought back to his fit of laughter when the old toad called the white-haired man beside him in his 40s Jiraiya-chan and lectured him like a grandfather. After he congratulated Minato, he handed over a small pack, which held a short-sleeved long white coat with flame patterns on the edges with bright red kanji running down the center of its back, shouting and announcing who the man is from miles away by the words Yondaime Hokage. Toriku thought back to the endless teasing that Minato received from him and Kushina when he had started wearing that coat. He almost chuckled, but he restrained himself when in the distance of the never-ending grass field, he finally spotted the post. They reached the border quite fast just as last time. It didn't even take a day, however Toriku could feel the strain in his muscles this time. They slowed down before the guards became suspicious and now they were slowly walking toward the bunker. A shinobi jumped down from the flat roof, eyeing them suspiciously, then his eyes wandered toward Toriku and Jiraiya and he let out a weary and relieved sigh. "I'm glad you arrived at Jiraiya-sama." The shinobi bowed and smiled at the white-haired man. "You are careless. What if we were Iowa forced under a henge?" The ninja slowly shook his head and chuckled. "The chances are minimal, and I doubt that any of them would dare transform into you. Especially not to Toriku-san." The teen raised an eyebrow and carefully eyed him from head to toe, but he couldn't identify the man, he had never met him before. In the end, he just shrugged to himself and counted that to Minato's fame. The man waved a hand to follow him, and they stepped inside the sparse facility. Toriku unconsciously expanded his senses to map his surroundings. He felt 3 more shinobi around the post, 1 on the rooftop, 1 outside and 1 more inside. Jiraiya turned toward the shinobi. "Anything we should be aware of?" The shinobi shook his head in response. "Nothing happened during the last week. Everything seems peaceful. Only some patrolling IWA troops passed the post from a distance, but they didn't show any belligerence." Jiraiya nodded and handed over a scroll to the shinobi, who accepted and stowed it inside his pocket. "I'll escort you around. When you settle down we'll leave. I can't wait to finally sleep in my own bed." Jiraiya chuckled and placed a hand on the ninja's shoulder. The man quickly, but efficiently showed them around and they finished on the roof where the remaining of his team already waited for them, packed and ready to leave. The shinobi pointed towards several parts of the landscape where they would find the sensing seals. He also asked Jiraiya to place more on other places of the ground. After a half-hour-long report he finally nodded to himself in satisfaction and they left to head back to Konoha. Jiraiya turned around to face the team, pointing toward Kakashi and Toriku. "You'll take the first round for the watch post. From now on, we will work 12-hour rounds. Be alert, we may be nearing peace, but you never know." The boys nodded, and Jiraiya pointed toward Toriku. "Send out some clones and check those seals. Maybe you could upgrade them a little. They're barrier seals after all." Toriku nodded and grinned as 50 clones appeared beside him, and dissolved in every distance of the compass. The Sennin only rolled his eyes, muttering about swanky teens while he and Rin moved back to the establishment to rest before they would take over for the boys. Toriku had laid down in the middle of the roof and crossed his arms behind his neck and started to watch the night sky. An angry snort echoed on the roof and Kakashi moved next to him with a dangerously narrowed eye. "What do you think you're doing?" Toriku didn't move, only his eyes turned toward the Jounin. "Guarding the post." Kakashi kicked his leg, forcing Toriku to sit up and meet his angry eye. "This is not a game, you know." The blonde let out a sigh. "I sent out 50 clones, and they already started to apply more security seals on the borderline. I've got better senses than you, or Jiraiya, so just relax. Nothing is going to happen." The Jounin didn't answer, only moved to the edge of the roof and moved his eyes to the forest belt. Toriko let out a sigh and moved next to the jounin. Look, I know why you're like this. But calm down. We're well prepared. Kakashi only blinked and didn't avert his gaze, but after a long minute he hesitantly nodded. I'm a little tense. I noticed that. I hate to be near the IWA borders. I know. And Aniki also knows. I think that's why he sent us here. Kakashi didn't answer, only clenched his hands into fists. I also figured that out, but this is the sour medicine Minato gave me and Rin. Don't think it is easier for him, sending out his comrades and his friends to missions where they could be killed. Kakashi slowly shook his head. I don't think so. And we also know that. We are shinobi. Toriko rolled his eyes and let out a sigh before he moved to the other side of the roof and sat down, this time to properly do his guarding role despite his 50 clones running around the post. The days were moving with the speed of a snail. Nothing had happened in the last 3 days. The most interesting event was when one of Kakashi's summons chased a fox away from the post. Toriko sat on the edge of the flat roof, his legs flung freely over the edge, while he was watching the forest belt. He closed his eyes and extended a thin layer of chakra in the clearing, watching any tweak in its flow, but nothing came. He let out a weary sigh and glanced over his shoulder toward Kakashi, who had sent out one of his freshly trained Niken to patrol. Toriko really likes the dog, even though their first meeting hadn't ended tenderly. Sometimes he still felt the sharp fangs of the small pug around his ankle, and the small pooch still couldn't explain why he had done that. However, maybe it was just because he couldn't talk properly yet. Aside from the limited vocabulary that Kakashi had already taught to the mutt, he mostly just barked. Just then, said small Niken reappeared in the high grass at the horizon, drawing a thin, straight line toward the tower in the vegetation. Pakken finished his patrol. Kakashi nodded and moved next to the blonde and leaned over the edge to eye his small comrade as he was approaching them. The dog hopped onto the vertical wall and easily ran up to them and sat down, panting heavily. He looked up at Kakashi with his sparking, intelligent eyes frisking his tail lightly. He was still young, still in the beginning of his training. He hadn't yet developed the stamina for a long run or to take part in a real fight. He just wasn't that type, but the pup was almost as stubborn as Toriko and had an exceptional nose which could rival his own. Anything? Kakashi asked curiously, waiting for Pakken to catch his breath. But the small dog only shook his head. Kakashi nodded and dismissed the dog, who disappeared in a puff of smoke after a nod toward the blonde boy. Toriko stretched his limbs and yawned before he settled down to his previous place on the edge of the roof again. Hey Kakashi. What have you been doing with Jiraiya lately? I mean with those scripts. The Jounin's only visible eye twitched and Toriko could swear that the edge of his ears turned flaming red in the dark night. However, his face didn't give away any further reaction, nor did he answer the question. Only waved a hand to the blonde and turned his back on him and tensed his shoulders. The Chunin raised an eyebrow then shrugged, but curiosity never left him. He would have to investigate that a little later. They stayed in silence for long minutes until Toriko rubbed his burning eyes and let out a weary sigh, yawning again for maybe 100 times in the last hour. You should speak with Rin. The blonde glanced toward his companion with a confused face. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm perfectly fine. The Jounin turned back with a narrowed eye after a doubtful snort left his nose. Yeah, sure. Except you haven't slept 6 hours in total since we arrived here. The blonde's eyes twitched in irritation. Don't spy on me. I'm not spying on you. I just slept next to you. I'm neither blind nor deaf. I'm alright. No, you are not alright. You're exhausted, and the only reason you haven't dropped from fatigue is the soldier pills you eat when you think nobody is watching. If you don't speak with Rin, I'm going to speak with her. And believe me, it would be better if you go to her and not vice versa. She will still yell your hair down from your head, but maybe she could help and give you something to stop those nightmares. Toriko visibly flinched, but in the end let out a long, weary breath and closed his eyes. His mind almost immediately started to become numb, and he couldn't deny it anymore. He was truly exhausted to his very core. Okay. I'll speak with her when she's awake. His voice was faint, but Kakashi nodded in his satisfaction. Toriko suddenly stiffened, and a shiver ran across his spine. He looked around, and immediately expanded his chakra from the rooftop, earning a confused and worried expression from the Jounin whose muscles instantly tensed, ready to react if necessary. What? Kakashi whispered toward Toraku, who closed his eyes, frowning, then shook his head. Nothing. Nothing is out there. Kakashi frowned, when 5 clones appeared next to the blonde and jumped down from the roof and ran toward the forest line. Just a precaution. The Jounin moved next to Toraku and revealed his left eye under his hitite. The tomatoes started to whirl slowly as he moved his side over the landscape, looking for any hint of chakra inside the woods beside the seals. Finally he nodded and replaced his forehead protector, but he didn't relax his tense muscles. The 2 teens stayed in full alert for hours, but only a lonely deer appeared from the forest and slowly moved to the middle of the clearing, then left after half-hour as silently as it came. Toraku let out a weary sigh. He felt as his eyelids became heavier as exhaustion started to take over his body and his brain. He shook his head to ease away the weariness, with little success. A strange feeling never left him, despite the fact that he'd expanded his senses to the maximum where he wouldn't go insane from the normal sounds and sense of the nature around him. He let out a weary sigh as he moved to the edge of the flat roof. A blonde clone popped up next to Kakashi. I'm going out for patrol. He will report if I find something. The young Jounin nodded and moved closer to the edge to watch as his blonde comrade landed gracefully in a crouch and ran toward the edge of the woods after several blonde heads popped into existence around him, dissolving into different directions of the woods. A nervous frown appeared on his face, his muscles tensed unconsciously when the last golden crown disappeared from his sight. Toraku jumped down from a branch, landing in a crouch in a small clearing, and slowly moved closer to an ancient old, giant oak tree. He ran through a short chain of hand signs and gently placed his palm on the raw surface of the tree. A complex, ink-black spider web pattern appeared on the small clearing, made by kanji, symbols, curves, and straight lines. The blonde Chunin leaned closer to the center of the pattern, forced it to glow with a tiny amount of chakra and examined it carefully, looking for anything suspicious on the predominant seal which controlled all the other ones along the borderline in this district. Toraku let out a weary sigh and rubbed his burning eyes. I really need a nice long nap. A clone popped into existence. Tell Kakashi that I'm going to check the last 2 of the control seals. I will be back in half an hour at maximum. The clone nodded and disappeared with a loud puff, breaking the complete silence in the ink-black night. The memory of his previous command immediately appeared in his head. At that very moment he felt dizzy and had to lean on the large tree for support, then shook his head to ease away the feeling. I'm more exhausted than I thought. Something started to nag at the back of his mind, but he didn't have time to react as he heard a muffled thud, then immediately felt a small sting in his neck. His head started to spin with a force he never felt before. His knees gave up and he fell to the ground limply. His brain still worked, but he couldn't focus his thoughts, nor his chakra to warn the others. He dimly saw movement from the corner of his eyes and distantly realized that his clones had disappeared, but his dizzy and continuously spinning brain couldn't process the memories. He struggled, forcing his brain and muscles to work, forcing his eyes to focus. A foot in ninja sandals shrouded his vision, and his eyelids started to give up the fight with gravity. A distant urge reached his raw mind, screaming desperately to move his body, but he couldn't even twitch a finger. He drifted to the blackness of unconsciousness, while the screams in his mind slowly died down. Kakashi glanced toward the clone, who stoically sat on the edge of the roof, his legs hanging in the air. The clone suddenly stiffened and turned toward the young Jounin. Message from the boss. He is checking the last 2 control seals and he will be back in half an hour. The Jounin nodded and turned his head toward the woods again. He saw a sudden faint glow from the corner of his eyes. His muscles moved unconsciously, snapping his head in the direction of the light, when he felt a faint stinging sensation in his neck. The last thing he could note with his numb mind was a muffled puff as the clone disappeared before he lost consciousness, not even a second after the sting in his neck. He couldn't even feel the pain of his head connecting with the rooftop with a muffled thud. They were moving. He felt it vaguely, but he couldn't open his eyes. He felt dizzy, still unable to focus his thoughts. The last bits of his rational mind were desperately struggling to reach for his chakra, but his aggressively spinning brain made all attempts in vain. A moan left his mouth as his body jerked when the one who was carrying him landed hard on a branch, forcing his lungs to discharge the air from his limp body. In the back of his mind he realized that they had stopped. At least he couldn't feel the wind in his blonde locks or on his skin anymore. He dimly felt as his eyelids started to twitch by the strain of trying to open them. He's gaining consciousness again. Give him another dose. He was harshly dropped to the ground. He already got a second one. A third could kill him. A satisfied snort reached his ears, but he could process the previous sentence for several long seconds. That would be a relief. He attempted to force his desperately screaming muscles to move, and he was finally able to open his eyelids halfway. The only thing his spinning brain recognized after long seconds of delay was two hexagonal patterns on a metal plate, which occupied his vision as the ninja leaned closer to him. IWA. A dim sensation of stinging pain reached his foggy mind and his vision started to become darker again. He barely recognized the needle in the straightening shinobi's hand, before he drifted back into unconsciousness. Kakashi felt a hand on his shoulders and a warm sensation ran through him by healing chakra, then someone shook him violently. He let out a groan, and forced his mind and body to work. After a long minute, he finally managed to open his eyelids halfway. His dizzy eye met two pairs of worried ones above him. Finally, he shook his head and forced his aching muscles to sit up with the help of Jiraiya. What happened? The Jounin blinked and jerked his head to the side, sending another fuzzy feeling through his abused brain. Where is Toraku? Rin and Jiraiya shared a worried look, and the white-haired man finally shook his head. You were ambushed. I still don't know exactly how, but they took him. They must be about half an hour ahead. We are lucky I came to check on you. Kakashi wanted to jump to his feet, but he faltered and would have landed flat if Jiraiya hadn't caught his arm. He shook his head again, and this time he was able to stand straight, leaning on the. He felt as his inside twisted with the urge to get rid of his last meal, but it fortunately died down after 2 deep breaths. We have to track them down. Kakashi started with a cracking tone while Jiraiya examined the teen and nodded when he finally straightened, letting go of his hands as his foggy vision started to clear. Indeed. But we can't leave the post without a guard. We'll have to split, and our forces will decrease drastically. Those who took Toraku weren't greenhorn shinobis. They managed to sneak up on him. Kakashi nodded. He was exhausted. Otherwise that would just be impossible. But who? Jiraiya nodded. They were only after Toraku. Maybe they want to use him as political pressure. I could imagine this kind of thing from that old geezer Inoki. Jiraiya rubbed his temple, forcing his brain to work harder. Rin, you will stay here with one of my summons. But first we'll need your every skill. I need Kakashi to chase them since they didn't get far. The girl nodded and sent a worried look toward Kakashi, whose sight still seemed to be a little foggy. Kakashi. We don't have time. I'll need your tracking skills. The boy nodded and ran through a chain of seals to summon Pakken. Why didn't we get rid of the others? Killing one of Konoha's Sannin would be a great effort from Iowa toward the other nations. Our mission was only to get that sissy. And don't think that getting rid of one of the Sannin would be a piece of cake. This time no killing, it doesn't matter how bad you, or I want it. The Tsuchikage wants him alive. Yes, Commander. A defeated voice reached Toraku's mind. His brain was still foggy and dizzy, but at least he could sense his chakra this time. Shouldn't we give another shot to Sissy? He's already received enough to knock out an elephant, however. He's been too still in the last half hour, not like before. Toraku didn't move. He felt that his hands were tied tightly behind his back and his ankles together, and he could smell the metallic scent of his own blood as the razor-sharp wires cut into the soft flesh of his wrist. His captor threw down his body roughly to the hard soil again, but he forced himself to bear the pain as his head met with the hard ground with a muffled thud. He forced his body to relax and lie limply. He started to hear muffled voices around him more clearly 10 minutes ago, but this time, when he started to come out of the darkness, he focused with every nerve to stay still and limp on the shoulder of whoever was carrying him away from the post. Toraku felt a sharp object graze across his lying shape, but he forced his nerves to calm down and stay still, despite his rising panic. He heard muffled footsteps, and a soft breath on his arching neck as one of the IWA shinobi leaned closer to examine him closely. Not good, this is not good. He suddenly felt a foot stamp painfully into his stomach and he heard the guttural laughter of a man after it. That isn't part of our mission. The baritone barked toward Toraku in a commanding voice, probably addressed to the one who kicked him. Commander, he only gave him what he deserves. A higher voice could be heard, probably a kunoichi, while the commander snorted in displeasure. Give him another shot, just for precaution. We have to reach the borders as fast as possible. Toruk dreadfully forced his brain to focus, and when the man finally stepped away, probably to get the needle with the drug, he knew this would be his only chance to act before he was forced back into unconsciousness again. He desperately reached toward his pathetically shaking chakra and, with effort beyond what a normal human could exert, he forced it to flow through his coils. His eyes snapped open and a satisfied smirk appeared inside his still dim mind when he saw a foggy picture of a man flinching a step back in surprise as his mud-brown eyes locked with foggy azure-blue ones. 4 shadow clones popped into existence in front of him, barricading him from the shinobi with their bodies. The clones looked weary, their minds also dizzy and hazy, while their limbs were trembling violently with the effort to even stand straight. Impossible, he distantly heard as one of the IWA shinobi whispered in disbelief. One clone wobbled a step back and popped out of existence when he suddenly dropped to the ground. Toruk forced another wave of chakra out of his body and a clone appeared crouching next to him and immediately started to cut the wires around his joints with the sharpened wind chakra. The blonde hissed when the trembling blade cut deep into his ankle. Finally the last wire was cut, but before he could move the Iowa nuns shook off their surprise and jumped into action. The blonde chunin pathetically, but still quickly rolled to the side to evade the exploding spikes from the ground under him, dispelling his clones immediately. He forced himself on all fours, panting heavily by the strain, feeling like an animal driven into a corner. His cerulean orbs flung from shinobi to shinobi, desperately trying to catch his breath after that small movement. The 4 IWA Nines slowly approached him, ready to swing into action. One of them already had a needle in his hands, ready to push him back into unconsciousness. He slowly moved his hand onto his leg, to get a kunai from his pouch, but he realized that it was gone. His eye twitched in irritation, but his hands traveled back toward his still secured headband without a pause in the movement. He dimly saw as the 4 shinobi jumped toward him, most of them already forming several hand seals. His sight became foggy again, his mind started to spin, and with his last resort, he finally found the small paper tag hidden behind the metal plate and slammed it to the ground after he channeled some chakra into it. Then he fell limply to the ground as his trembling joints gave up the fight with gravity. Toruk blinked rapidly, shook his head and slowly opened his eyes to glance toward the foggy silhouette of 4 frozen shinobi on the other side of a small, wobbling purple barrier. He forced himself onto his hands and knees, panting unstoppably and forcing his limbs to move into a sitting position. Toruk slowly closed his eyes while he distantly heard punches and kunai clinging on the outside of his wobbling barrier. A satisfied smile appeared on his face. The barrier wouldn't last long with this wretched chakra control, but at least he could gain some time to gather himself and think of a plan. He felt a vibration under him, as an attack reached the lower part of the barrier, buried in the soil. He shook his head to clear his mind, however with little success, and he finally fixed his gaze on the purple glow of the barrier. His vision became clearer, the silhouettes sharper, and the spinning of his brain died down to a more tolerable level. 4 IWA shinobi snarled at him, probably emitting a large amount of killing intent. Fortunately the barrier intercepted it. He doubted his body would be able to tolerate it. Toruk couldn't surpass the temptation, and he sent a cocky grin toward one of them, earning a narrowed gaze from the largest member of the team from stone. Surround the barrier. Don't forget we need him alive. All IWA Nin moved to the 4 corners of the barrier without hesitation as Toruk eyed them curiously. Not that he could do anything more in his pitiable state. He pushed himself up to stand on his wobbling legs, leaning onto his knees to help support his weight. His eyes moved toward the commander, and he finally straightened himself, reeling a little from the effort, and forced more chakra into his fading shield. The shinobi's eyes shined victoriously as the purple barrier wobbled and a crack appeared on the side after a long 10-minute staring contest. Toruk slowly turned his head toward the crack and narrowed his eyes, while forcing his still trembling chakra to flow smoother. His limbs felt like they were made of lead and every little movement sent pain toward his weary brain. He moved his arms together and crossed his fingers, preparing to perform his signature jutsu, when his barrier collapsed. Normally, he wouldn't need to use any hand signs for that, but now he needed every bit of help with his wobbling chakra to perform any kind of jutsu. He was lucky the first time to be able to make those 5 pathetic clones, and they were even solid and useful. Another crack appeared above him, and he tensed his aching muscles. The 4 IWA Nins moved to stance, and also started to form hand signs, preparing to attack when the seal faded away. A small purple shard fell on his shoulder, and when it touched him, The barrier collapsed into millions of pieces and disappeared when they reached the ground. The 4 shinobi took that as the signal and jumped toward him. Near! A barking voice echoed in a clearing. A silhouette of the white-haired ran through the clearing inside the forest, the trees spotted with giant mushrooms, with a small mutt in his hands. The man's form blurred by the insane speed while they were traveling. The heavy breathing of Kakashi could be heard only meters behind him as they rushed with insane speed deeper into the dark woods. I won't let it happen again, Kakashi muttered to himself between 2 harsh breaths, and he forced more chakra into his legs. 2 clones appeared next to him and grabbed his still crossed arms to throw him out of the way of the 4 IWA Nines. He landed hard on his back, carving a long straight line into the ground where his body slid through the hard soil. A painful groan left his mouth and he could only roll to the side, before a chakra-boosted fist slammed where he was a blink ago. He rolled further and moved to a pathetic stance, almost falling back. The 4 shinobi appeared around him and jumped into action immediately. Toraku struggled between the punches for several long minutes, and he could taste his own blood inside his cracked mouth. His only real success was when he managed to destroy that damn needle. He fell to the ground from a well-placed hit on his temple and the world suddenly became soundless, except a sharp whistle, while dark spots danced in his vision. The teen struggled on all fours in the middle of a mud puddle created by an earth release, while the IWA Nines tried to catch him. He desperately shook his head to ease away the whistle and gain back the focus in his eyes, but before it happened a familiar foot kicked painfully into his stomach again, forcing out every bit of air from his lungs. He fell back to the ground on his stomach with a disgusting splashing sound as his body hit the mud. He turned his head and tried to open his eyes, however he couldn't open the left one. He couldn't move. He never felt so weak, so vulnerable, so defeated. A harsh voice was continuously screaming inside his head, to get up, to fight, sometimes even teasing him, how sick and pathetic he was. Toraku hardened himself, and slowly moved his hands under his chest to push himself up one more time. Give up and just stay still. Don't make this harder than necessary. He heard a harsh baritone voice whisper into his ear and he felt a rough hand on his shoulder. An animalistic snarl left his mouth at the unpleasant feeling. I am as stubborn. I'll never give up. A foxy grin appeared on his face unwittingly, while he heard his own cracking, but determined voice from a distance. He tensed his aching and heavy muscles to shove the man off of his back, before he could be knocked out, when he heard something in the distance. He blinked in surprise. Birds. Birds were chirping continuously. Not one, not a dozen, hundreds, maybe thousands of chirping birds could be heard from everywhere. His left shoulder started to ache painfully, like someone had stabbed him with a knife and twisted it, but he only managed a painful groan. The spinning feeling reappeared in his brain, while he distantly sensed that the dark night was starting to glow an azure blue while a familiar scent forced its way into his nose, suppressing the metallic scent of his own blood mixed with the wet soil and mud around him. He didn't sense anything else, only the chipping of 1,000 birds around him, and flashes of blue. 4 small furred paws appeared in front of his blurry eyes, distant yelps and explosions forced themselves into his raw ears. He turned his head slowly and looked into a pair of chocolate-brown worried eyes of the small pug. Pakun. The pup nodded and started to bark loudly next to the blonde, who forced his eyes shut by the irritating and loud voice. He heard as someone landed in the mud next to him, and he was finally able to open both of his eyes and turn his head toward the white-haired man. T took you long enough. You stopped at a bath? A cocky grin spread across his face, and the Sennin couldn't help but smile back softly. Stay there, Gaki, and don't move. Toraku snorted and let out a small chuckle when Jiraiya disappeared, jumping into the middle of the fight around them. A minute later a clone of Kakashi jumped next to the blonde, who already started to struggle himself up. And nice jutsu why you got. Where did you learn? The clone had chuckled awkwardly and helped him to sit up. The blonde shook his head and split out sidelong some blood, then leaned on Kakashi to straighten himself on his wobbling legs, coughing to clear his throat. They gave me something I don't think I can help. My chakra system is totally messed up. The clone nodded. Can you stand alone? I'm not that pathetic, you know. He sent a foxy grin to the clone, who rolled his 2 visible eyes and nodded before he jumped after the into battle. Jiraiya held up one of his hands to stop Kakashi from rushing forward where the 4 IWA Nines surrounded the obviously woozy Toraku. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes at the sight as Toriko was wobbling on his legs, desperately trying to defend himself. The 4 IWA shinobi were using only low-level jutsu to capture him, and taijutsu to knock him down. Toriko was obviously able to free himself. Jiraiya gestured to Kakashi to the right with his head and put the small mutt down on the ground. The Jounin nodded, and without a word he positioned himself next to the group. He immediately uncovered his Sharingan and glanced to the, waiting desperately for the sign to jump into action. The slowly ran through a chain of hand signs and nodded to the Jounin. Lightning chakra encompassed his fist and quickly surrounded his arm almost to his shoulders. The familiar voice of 1,000 chirping birds echoed in the clearing, forcing the IWA shinobi to freeze when Kakashi burst out from his hiding place with insane speed. His attack cut deep scars into the ground where the lighting chakra plunged into the soil as he dashed toward the large shinobi leaning above Toriko's laying form, ready to knock him out with the back of his kunai. He shot his hand toward the IWA commander and felt as his hand plunged through the man's body, straight into his heart, before his body melted away into a pile of mud. Kakashi dismissed the mud clone, turned, and leaped toward a kunoichi who had already started forming hand seals without a pause in his motion. He jumped and slid across the mud to strike her from behind, but his hands didn't reach her. A stone wall appeared between them, but Kakashi didn't bother himself to stop. He used the wall and leaped toward the caster from it. Jiraiya stayed in his hiding spot, watching the enemy's reactions carefully, as Kakashi rushed toward the commander of the team. A half-smile ran across his face, and he jumped into the battle forming one single hand seal, rushing toward an empty spot. Ranjishigami no Jutsu, Wild Lion's main technique. His hair suddenly expanded, hardened and exploded into the ground, forming a wild, lion-like snarl. Then narrowed his eyes, and with another seal his hair dragged out a giant shinobi from the soil. The lion-like fangs had bitten hard into the shinobi's shoulder, drawing small crimson lines of blood on his brown flak jacket. He released the jutsu, and his hair moved back to its original form. Jiraiya made another hand seal, and a shadow clone jumped toward Kakashi to provide backup with the other 3 IWA Jounin. Jiraiya already recognized the man in front of him, and he would be a hard nut to crack. He hoped Kakashi could handle the others since he had to face the second commander of Iwa's shinobi forces, Kitsuchi. The man narrowed his eyes and glanced toward his comrades from the corner of his eye. The Sannin utilized the opportunity and immediately jumped toward the man, landing a hard punch to his temple to knock him out in one shot. A painful grimace ran through the sage's face as his fist connected with solid rock instead of hard bone. The commander's right fist became encased with rock and he swung his punch toward Jiraiya in response. Meanwhile, Jiraiya ran through hand seals and his hair immediately expanded, surrounding the Sannin's form with sharp spikes of the Hari Jizo, Needle Jizo. A countless number of sharp needles shot toward the commander, who jumped backward and ran through numerous hand signs in midair, slamming his palms onto the ground when he landed. Doton, Doryahiki, Earth Release Wall. A mud wall appeared in front of the commander, and immediately hardened, deflecting the sharp needles. Jiraiya didn't waste any time, he jumped above the wall to release a fire technique toward the commander. Kakashi distantly sensed the clone of Jiraiya as it hopped down next to Toriko to check up on his condition, while he was occupied with the other 3 ninja. He heard the cracking voice of the blonde, then he felt the same clone jump next to him. How is he? Disoriented, probably drugged, beaten, cocky. He'll be okay. Kakashi nodded and crossed his fingers to create a shadow clone for himself. He nodded toward the blonde and the clone jumped to Toriko. It's time to get serious. Kakashi nodded his approval and shot out toward the kunoichi in front of him, drawing out his short katana while Jiraiya's clone jumped toward the remaining 2 IWA nin. Jiraiya was finally able to single the commander with a fire release, who was continuously hidden underground during their fight. He glanced toward where his clone and Kakashi were fighting with the remaining IWA Jounin. The bit down his fingertip, summoning a man-sized stoic-looking green toad with a katana on his back. Gamma Hero, I need some backup here. The toad blinked, looked around and immediately jumped into stance at the sight of the charging IWA commander. Jiraiya flinched when his clone disappeared by a spike from the earth and his memories of their fight poured back to him, the charging Kakashi and Toriko leaning against a tree trunk to support his weight in the background. A violent scream echoed in the clearing as Kakashi slammed his hand onto the ground and sent a right-on, Jibashi, lightning style, earth flash, jutsu toward the remaining IWA shinobi. The commander froze in space as he turned to see his last comrade fall limply to the ground with an inhuman shout. He immediately turned around and charged toward Kakashi and Toraku, his hands forming seals with blurring speed, while he simply jumped over the stunned toad. He leaped into the air and slammed his hands onto the ground, sending his last bit of chakra into the soil. Doton, Sando no Jutsu, Earth Release, Mountainous Earth Technique. The earth cracked in half between the two young and weary shinobi, and two enormous rock formations appeared in order to close around and smash them to pieces. Only the Sanin's quick reflexes, shooting white hair forward to push them out of the technique's range, saved the two boys from becoming as thin as a pancake. A defeated roar left the commander's mouth as he fell to his knees, his body trembling from the strain and the chakra exhaustion. Jiraiya was breathing heavily as he wiped some blood from his forehead while glancing toward the two boys. Toraku limped toward them, leaning on Kakashi's shoulders, until they reached the stock-still laying and panting form of the commander. That was a very nasty technique, Jiraiya stated coldly, eyeing the scratches and cuts on Kakashi and the obviously more aware eyes of Toraku, who slowly lowered himself to the ground to sit down, hanging into the Jounin's arm for support. What the heck did you give me? It's so damn annoying. I'm going to kill you, Katsuchi hissed between his teeth. However, he wasn't able to move even a finger. He put his last bit of chakra into that last technique, and every part of his body felt numb and alien. You should know when to give up, Jiraiya stated calmly while he worked to secure the enemy ninja with wires. Katsuchi's eyes flared with burning hatred as they moved from Toraku to Kakashi and back. I'm going to kill you. Toraku narrowed his eyes as he glanced at the commander. What did we even do to you? Geez. Stone and fire are in the middle of a peace talk. You killed them. All of your comrades are alive, they're just knocked out, Toraku stated calmly, while he examined a nasty bruise on his side, hissing when his fingers touched his probably broken ribs. He shook his head again and blinked when dizziness started to appear again in his mind. You killed them. The blonde's eyes twitched. We didn't kill anyone, so just shut up. The always stoic Kakashi burst out as the gathering tension broke his mental walls. You were the one who killed them 3 months ago. You and your damn Hokage. The flares of hatred almost glowed in his eyes as he attempted to lunge toward Kakashi, who narrowed his eyes next to the Hatake. Kakashi and your damn Hokage. You were the one who killed my brother-in-law at the Canopy Bridge. It was you. And your damn Hokage slaughtered my wife on the front lines on the same day. Kakashi obviously flinched, and he slowly turned his head away from the commander. I killed, because if I hadn't then I would have been killed. Same with Sensei, we are shinobi. He started calmly, but the IWA ninja didn't bother to even listen to the young Jounin. His mind became foggy as anger and hatred took over the rational part of his mind, shouting away his pain to the world. I hope you remember him. His name was Kako. Remember his name for the rest of your pathetic life. Kako. He and his team were sent out to scout. He had black eyes and thick, shaggy brown hair. I hope his 2 blades made that scar on your face. Life for life. I will kill you, and that blonde. Your Hokage took away my wife, and I will take away his relative. Kakashi's muscles tensed, and he narrowed his eyes. A small tremble ran down his spine and he felt rage and hatred rising inside him, bubbling and burning away everything of the outside world, as the realization hit him hard. I will remember your brother-in-law for the rest of my life, but not because you told me to. His Sharingan glowed dangerously and the tomatoes started to spin menacingly. Kakashi suddenly burst forward, his short sword entered to the ground a millimeter from Katsuchi's throat as the Jounin slammed it into the soil. His hands were shaking from his emotions, his whole body trembled unstoppably, and his sword drew a thin red line on the commander's neck. He killed my comrade. My best friend, the person who I looked at like he was my brother, and I didn't even get the opportunity to tell him so. Life for life, you said? Kakashi's voice was ice cold, full of the same burning and boiling hatred as the IWA nin, which sent chills down Toraku's spine. Will it be an equivalent if I kill you? Just do it. The commander narrowed his eyes and split out the word like it was sour poison, and in the end chuckled insanely. Jiraiya folded his hands in front of his chest and his eyes darkened as he watched the flames of pure hatred in the eyes of both Katsuchi and Kakashi. He stepped forward, opening his mouth to interfere, but before he could say anything, something inside forced him to stop as he met the azure blue orbs of Toraku. Kakashi slowly pulled out his katana from the ground to make one more, this time precise, cut with it. You'll let him kill you? You'd throw away your own life that easily? The IWA Nin blinked and a spark of consciousness returned to his haunted eyes and Kakashi stopped his movement. Toraku slowly raised himself from the ground, his legs wobbling as he leaned on his knees to support himself before he straightened and stood above the prostrate commander and the crouching Kakashi. And what would happen if Kakashi kills you? Will that bring back Obito? Or maybe your brother-in-law will be resurrected? Or your wife? You know what will happen? I know. Your relatives will swear vengeance on killing him. If they kill him, his friends will go after your relatives. And so on. Hatred only gives birth to death, which in the end will bear more hatred. Only peace can stop this never-ending circle. Jiraiya narrowed his eyes while Kakashi eventually calmed down his nerves, which were stretched to the breaking point. His hands never left his katana, but the killing intent he emitted slowly dissipated. Kitsuchi forced his sore muscles to move and turned his head to look up at the blonde shinobi. He locked his dark eyes with the cerulean orbs to find sadness on his face and pity in his eyes. It doesn't matter. You speak of peace. There won't be any peace. There is no such thing as peace. Toraku stayed silent for a long minute, carefully examining the haunted eyes of the commander, the eyes burning with the flames of hatred, melting away everything else as he saw Minato's face despite the differences. A soft smile ran across his features, a soft and caring smile, which only a mother could show to her own child. The IWA commander blinked in surprise. The smile disappeared from his face, and from sheer determination replaced it, flaring unstoppably in his azure blue orbs like a sapphire inferno. There is peace. Toraku's voice was firm yet soft, echoing, yet still quiet, harsh, but still pleasant like a lullaby. I'll break the cycle of hatred. I'll break this curse. If there is such a thing as peace, I'll find it. Believe in me. I won't give up. Jiraiya distantly felt somewhere that his hands had fallen limply to his side and his lips parted in his surprise and awe. The commander blinked once more in confusion. Who the hell do you think you are? Toraku glanced down calmly at their captive, his azure orbs never let go of the determination for a long silent minute. The silence suddenly broke when the determination disappeared from his face, replaced by his well-known foxy grin. Jiraiya sighed, but a thought never left his mind, a thought from a prophecy, about one of his students. Well, he was actually a Jounin sensei. A sensei of Toraku who was technically his student. Toraku suddenly froze. His arms didn't move, although he wanted to grab his temper and scream as something cracked in his head and started to burn like an inferno, tearing his brain to shreds, bubbling and melting away his sanity. The pain suddenly stopped as fast as it came, and the only thing he felt was sheer exhaustion. He distantly sensed his knees give up holding his weight, and his body slowly falling to hit the hard. He didn't feel the pain of the impact. He sluggishly opened his eyes, turning his head as he calmly realized that he had passed out from exhaustion. He was again inside the never-ending sewer in the ankle-deep water. He slowly shook his head and stood up. His body almost cheerfully began to march toward his final destination, where he would find that damn old rusty door without a handle, and in the end he would drown in the ice-cold water. But he didn't care anymore. Somehow he felt happy and calm beyond words. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out, Shinobi.